Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Friends and Enemies. And I am in America. Alex Benesch, my co-host, is in Germany, and we're into this part two of the Cold War, a whole bunch of parts. We're going to try to go into what happened with the wars of decolonialization, the anti-colonial wars, especially France. We're going to be focused on this time because we've got the Algerian War and the beginning of the Vietnam War and how the communist versus the West thing all plays into this. We talked about China last week, so I might begin by talking about the complexities of the relationship between the French, the British, and the Americans. It goes back to the American Revolution, where the Americans are fighting the British, trying to get their independence, and the French came in on the side of the Americans, and they helped us. That was one time the French fleet beat the British fleet, and Lord Cornwallis had to surrender at Yorktown because he was trapped. And so America got its independence, and France and America were these great friends. The American Revolution happened, and America was split on that. You had the Federalists thought that the revolution was too extreme. The Anti-Federalists, a lot of them thought that people like Jefferson, for example, that became the Democratic Party ultimately in America under Jefferson, kind of looked kindly on the French Revolution. And then you had the XYZ affair where America and France almost went to war. And then you had the War of 1812, where essentially we were fighting the British at the same time that Napoleon was fighting the British. And again, we end up against the British, basically on fighting the same enemy as the French. And the French and British, they for centuries, they fought each other,
Yeah.
And so there was this, yeah, and of course they have these nasty words for each other. But a funny thing happened on the way to the 20th century. France and Britain drew closer. In World War One, they were allies, and of course America intervened again in World War One, and to help save France from the Germans, and to win World War One for the Allies. So again, there's this closeness. So we got to return the favor to France in 1917 and 18. And then, of course, but France, modern France, and if you go back to some of the works by French anti-communists, France really had a very strong socialist element in a strong socialist party. It had a socialist party, a communist party, and France would have these left-wing prime ministers, and we're talking about the French Fourth Republic or Third Republic rather, sorry, before World War II. And of course, in World War II, we end up on the side of the Allies, but France has been conquered. A lot of French Vichy collaboration with the Germans, arguably a lot of hard feelings because the British destroyed the French fleet, so it wouldn't fall into the hands of Hitler. And so there was fighting between British forces and French forces in Syria and Madagascar. And then with the British-American invasion of North Africa, there was fighting between British against the French in North Africa. It was very brief fighting, though. And so France was a country that its troops fought on both sides, both against the Allies and against the Nazis in the war. And not happily. I mean, they basically got defeated until the very end when a full French army was fighting on the Allies. And again, if you look at the written record, I've looked at some of the conferences that Eisenhower had with the French, and he wasn't exactly nice to them. And in fact, the Battle of Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower took full responsibility, but those French troops nearby were weaker than they said they were, and they couldn't help, and blah blah blah. So there's always this tension with the French. And de Gaulle, who kind of initially was the hero of France after the war, who retired from French politics, had this. He didn't really trust the Americans because of the way they behaved during World War II. There was this plan by Roosevelt to take over and govern France, which de Gaulle got ahead of and prevented. But de Gaulle, to get France to be truly independent, he compromised himself with the communists. And I get this testimony from this French intelligence officer. This book is Lamia, that was his code name, and his name was Tyrod de Vajoli. and he actually defected. He left France, hid out in Mexico and the U.S. because of Gallitzin, because of the Anatoly Gallitzin defection. Gallitzin had said that the Americans are going to be spied on, that the KGB has ordered the French service. They control the French service. The KGB controls the French intelligence, and they're going to order French intelligence to spy on America's ICBMs and strategic bombers. And de Valjoly was a French intelligence liaison in Washington. And when he was introduced to Gallitzin's testimony by American intelligence officials, he said, well, I haven't gotten that order to spy on you yet. I would never do that. He then got recalled to Paris and was told to spy on the American nuclear program, which caused him to go back to the United States and basically defect. This is basically covered. This part of this is kind of related in the movie Topaz that was directed by the famous director of Alfred Hitchcock, who did Rear Window? And Vertigo. Vertigo is his best movie, and of course Rope.
Psycho.
Various Alfred. He did Psycho. Yeah. So Hitchcock did this movie Topaz, and it was really about Gallitzin's defection, and this French character is made in the movie. So this, and of course, this was very bad for U.S.-French relations. But there were bad things that happened then after the war, because France had a colonial empire, right? They had French Northwest Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and other sub-Saharan colonies. Then they had French Indochina, which they'd begun to invade in the 1860s. And they used the excuse that Catholics were being persecuted in French Indochina to go in there and then make an empire. So the French had this colonial empire that during World War II had basically been controlled by the Axis. Largely. I mean, French Indochina was occupied by the Japanese during the war. And so France wanted, of course, to get control of that back. Now, the United States, having been a colony, having been opposed to British colonialism, the United States had a certain sensitivity to this issue. Like, we're not a colonial power, right? We don't think of ourselves that way. I mean, the Philippines was a colony for us after the Spanish-American War, but we gave them their independence. I mean, Puerto Rico, we tried to get them to vote to leave, but they won't leave. Puerto Rico wants to remain our one chief colony. They don't want to go because it's a better deal for them. They get all kinds of freebies by being with us. So colonies are not a good thing. But the French had this real colonial empire, and this is where the communists are so ingenious in their strategy. And we're going to see how this strategy unfolds in the use of the tactics the communists use in this long war called the Cold War. These tactics get developed, they get perfected, and they are evil. I mean, we're going to talk about some pretty darn grisly, evil things the communists are doing, and yet the West gets blamed as being the more bloody, more evil, more oppressive side.
Yeah.
And so go ahead. So what would you comment on this?
Well, socialism was always a very dangerous phenomenon in France. I mean, some people argue that, the first big establishment of socialism actually happened in France. Yeah, because when Napoleon was around, the main debate was, should we remain a classic monarchy, or should we have a semi-monarchy like the Brits, or should we have a full republic like the Americans? But there was also this growing problem of people advocating for socialism. So that said, well, get rid of the king, get rid of all the other aristocracy, get rid of a bunch of other things, and not just end the old system, but to prevent any sort of capitalism from emerging, because that was always the worry of the socialism, which they spread among the general population. This worry that if we have a semi-monarchy or if we have a full republic, it will be controlled by a tiny group of people. So that's bad for the general population. So this was kind of the very simplistic, easy, these catchphrases that were tossed around. Now, of course, you cannot have an overnight change where everybody has, money and everything is happy and everything is peaceful. The world is just too complicated for that. But that was the simplistic message that was tossed around in France. And so Napoleon had and the follow-up governments, they had to establish banking. They had to play catch up with the Brits, because the Brits, they were already ahead. They had used science to great advantages. The British had created their own fractional reserve banking and the bond market. So the British were way ahead. So France was behind. France needed banking. And France needed industrialization. So what happened was they tried to attract foreign capital. Like, for example, the infamous Rothschild banking family, which I suspect was run by British/German aristocrats, because the House of Hessen, which was incredibly powerful and tied to various thrones, the House of Hessen had initially recruited the Rothschilds to perform tasks for Britain. But at some point, the Rothschilds had banking houses in France, Austria, Germany, Britain, and so on. And the French branch of the Rothschilds, they were getting involved in a big railway program, for example. So all these changes started to happen in France, and this is what the socialists, the early French socialists, were using to make the population angry. So they were combining some of these texts from the revolution phase with socialist ideas. So they were complaining about, now you had to pay to cross a bridge, you may have to pay to use a railway. There are these rich people who who start these new factories and all that. So this was sort of the big beginning of socialism, really. And some of this literature, even the socialist literature that was used in Germany, was oftentimes printed in France, because the socialists had some leeway in France, so they could print up these books and then ship them to Germany. And so this was kind of a serious development that not many people really thought of as that dangerous. And in this early socialist phase in France, they were using anti-Semitism as a way to get around the censorship, because you could not attack the French government directly and say capitalism is awful, we hate everything, we want everything shared with everybody, and everybody should have all kinds of control over a chaotic country. But this was just a convenient thing. By declaring this new form of industrialization and capitalism, by declaring it Jewish, they could get around the censorship and say it's parasitic, it's devilish, it's all these things. And so this was just for that specific time. Now, of course, socialist propaganda works without anti-Semitism, but whenever it's useful to them, they will use it. So when France was experimenting with another dictatorship, another republic, another dictatorship, this socialist movement started to grow and it got embedded into the general population, and that kept growing from generation to generation. Because you can use anything and every topic to get people angry and to present a very simple narrative to them. We see that nowadays with these university protests in America, when these young students, they protest on behalf of the Palestinians, who are run by the KGB anyway, but they don't know that. And it's just the same thing over and over again. You pick anything that people can be mad about, even if it doesn't really concern them directly, and then just apply the program. You just apply that specific plan, and you do it step by step by step by step. And that was a problem that became really noticeable when World War II ended, because the damage was already done. During this resistance phase, and when the Vichy collaborator government was done, France still wanted to be this sort of empire. France really wanted to assert itself also against the Americans and against everybody else. But the damage was already done. France was crawling with communists, and they were embedded everywhere. And
Yes.
you just cannot undo this mess in a matter of
Yeah.
weeks or months or even a few years. It takes basically decades to rid yourself of communists and
Well,
even
I should point out that major figures in the Chinese Communist Party and in the Vietnamese Communist Party went to school in Paris.
oh yeah, all
Ho Chi
these Chinese
Minh
guys.
went to school in France, right? Ho Chi Minh was educated in France. So was famously Mao's longtime prime minister and
Zhou
whose name
Enlai,
is
was it?
eluding. Zhou Enlai was educated in France. In fact, I think he knew Ho in France, and of course he spoke fluent French just like Ho did. And actually, I should explain when we talk about Oriental names. This goes for Japanese, Chinese, and Vietnamese names because we're going to be using some of the names. It's very confusing for Westerners because in Japan, in China, in Vietnam, your last name is first, your family name is first, your personal name is last. So when we say Ho Chi Minh, Ho is not his first name, it's his family name. Mr. Ho, Comrade Ho. Um, and so Min is just like, hey, Min, like, hey,
Yeah.
Joe, right? And it's like Mao Zedong, same thing. Mao is his family name. Yamamoto is the family name, right? So and they put that first. So just to explain that. So when you're hearing it, not to be confused when we talk about it, because we're going to talk about Ngo Dinh Diem, and they call him President Diem, but it's NGO is his
Yeah.
actual family name, and his brother's name is that. So it's so that's how we get kind of confused, and we'll talk about Diem and his brothers as the Diem brothers, but they're not. That's just Diem's first name, So so people can get confused. But maybe the best way to talk about these wars is to skip ahead to the key year of 1954, when the Algerian War started to get kicked off, and when the French were on the point of leaving Vietnam because of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, say these names. Is it okay? Did you have anything to say about before we get there? Any comments?
No, I think this is sort of what I just mentioned is what people should have in mind when we're talking about socialism in
Yeah,
France and kind of wanting to continue as an empire, but you're crawling with communist spies. The population is not really on board with, necessarily with a continuation of the old ways because of all that communist propaganda. So by trying to regain some of that centralization and power, you're also empowering these communist agents, and
right.
that can mess up the whole thing.
And by the way, I should mention what de Vojoli says about de Gaulle in there is very disappointing. He saw de Gaulle as his hero, but then he realized de Gaulle, to achieve the things he wanted to achieve for France at the end of World War II, compromised himself with the communists. And this is de Vojoli's opinion and then he had people around him who were communist agents, which eventually, if you were to go into Moscow and talk to KGB or party people, say, oh, we have a lot of control in France. I mean, they don't 100% control it, but they have a lot of control. And so at the same time, the Russians are supporting these movements in North Africa, both in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, and in Vietnam and Indochina, to revolt against the French Empire. And the communists want to look good, so they're enemies of imperialism, right?
Yeah.
Even though communism is a kind of imperialism of its own, they want to posture this. So what's happened is now up to 1954, there hasn't been much going on in Algeria. You got basically in Algeria, you've got nearly 1 million Frenchmen living there, 900,000 Frenchmen. They considered in 1938 Algeria became part of France. It wasn't even considered a colony anymore because so many French lived there. Now, Tunisia and Morocco were still colonies, but Algeria was basically France. And the cities, like Algiers, was 60% European. It was a 60% European city,
Yeah.
right? And so we have to understand this model for what happened in Algeria. The Russians would like it to happen all over Europe, for all of Europe to become Algeria, right? Which is what this Muslim immigration. Oh, this is a great thing, the Russians think, because then we can destroy the West. And so the inception of this is in Algeria. So now in Vietnam, what's happened is China's become communist. They're supporting communists and this is why it's in the north, because it's closer to China. They're basically arming communists in the north. Those communists are fighting the French. They're trying to get independence. And of course, this battle develops around. Now, there's 175,000 French troops in Vietnam, in French Indochina, holding it down. And there's 10,000 of them are trapped in this place, this fortress called Dien Bien Phu, which is stupidly made on low ground, surrounded by high ground, so that the commanding heights are controlled by the communist armies around it.
Don't
so
move.
This is
we have surrounded you.
This
no,
is a bad,
you surrounded us. Wait, we had
right
ourselves
now
surrounded.
the Americans under Eisenhower, and we should just mention the Suez Crisis, which is going to happen in 56. We should not forget that, because the French also and the English get insulted by us in that crisis because we try to tilt towards the Egyptians, right? So anyway, what happens is, of course, and America's trying to have a good relationship with the Arabs, and we're not for colonialism. So the Americans, they've been kind of helping the French behind the scenes in fighting the communists in French Indochina. And of course, Ho Chi Minh pretends to be an agrarian reformer to get American help, because they know that we're kind of stupid and but we weren't stupid in this case. We realized Ho Chi Minh really is a communist. We shouldn't support him against the French. The French are our allies. But when the French were getting sick of the war in 54, and Dien Bien Phu was not a decisive defeat. It was 10,000 French soldiers surrendering out of 175,000. It's not decisive. The French could have fought and done crushing things, especially with our help. But Washington said to the French, we will help you maximally. We'll even use air power if you give Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos their independence. If you say, look, they're our allies now. They're not our colony. We're helping them to fight the communists. But the French were like, why are we here? If it's not our colony, why are we even here? Why do we care if the communists take it? We just want to get out of here. So Dien Bien Phu, it was more of an excuse for the French to just leave. Besides, things were starting to get, there were rumblings in Algeria in 1954. So this is Battle of Dien Bien Phu, I think is March it ended on May 7th, 1954. So this is when the French basically just this Geneva process, and the French didn't invite the Americans to participate, or the South Vietnamese to participate in this. They just willy-nilly sat down with the communists and said, all right, you can have the country north of the 17th parallel, right? That became the DMZ. That was like splitting North and South Korea, right? Yeah, okay, everything north of the 17th parallel, well, you can have it. We're getting out. And of course, this abandoned Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam to their own devices. And South Vietnam, they had Bao Dai was the emperor. Hue was the old capital of the old imperial Vietnam. It's sort of in the middle of the country. It's just below the DMZ, Hue is. And that's where a lot of I think the oldest pagoda is there. There's a lot of cultural things there. It's almost like Kyoto is to Japan, Hue is to Vietnam. And of course, the Emperor Bao Dai, I knew his granddaughter briefly. I worked with her when I worked for AT&T back in the 80s. But the Emperor, he appointed Ngo Dinh Diem to be president of the country of South Vietnam, and Diem was a brilliant, educated in classics. He was a Confucian scholar. I think he was. They would refer to him as a Mandarin, highly educated person, and he was Catholic. He was actually Catholic. His family was Catholic. But in Vietnam, that didn't matter. Vietnam, they had Buddhists. Stupid Americans thought Vietnam was a Buddhist country. It's majority Confucian country. The Buddhists and the Catholics are religious minorities. There's other ancestor worship. There's all kinds of cults and there's Muslims in Vietnam. believe it or not, and Protestants as well. So it's and there's a real religious tolerance in Vietnam. This is going to become important. And what the communists try to do, the communists try to use the multiplicity of religions as a way to take over the whole of Southeast Asia. And I'll explain how that works. But it's what's really important in Vietnam is the Ho Chi Minh, of course, then gets the North in '54 after these Geneva conference, and Ho Chi Minh begins his communist land reform, redistribution of wealth, right? And of course, what is he doing? Is collectivized farming. He's dispossessing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of peasants of their land. And so, what are they doing? They're voting with their feet. They're leaving the North.
Right.
And they're going south, and there's these huge numbers of refugees going, we can't live under communism. He's a monster. And of course, they're committing atrocities. The communists are murdering people who won't go along with them. So North Vietnam is this tyranny, and violence, ruthless violence is being used on people. And they're basically, the communists are colonizing, the major Buddhist organization becomes a communist front. Likewise, with all the other organizations in the country, the communists just colonize everything. And then what do?
Like in Tibet, yeah.
Like in Tibet, which was invaded by Mao in, what was it, 1959, 58?
I don't remember, but
they also invaded earlier on, too. There were multiple invasions.
That was a decent bit of cinema, maybe 20 years ago, the movie 7 Years in Tibet. This was Brad Pitt playing a German, what was it called, a mountaineer or a climber?
I think he was an archaeologist, wasn't he?
Wasn't he a climber of some sort?
He was. Yeah, he was a climber too. Yeah, I think he was a scientist. Yeah, maybe I'm mixing him up with something else.
He starts out as this arrogant guy who cares about his career and his self-image, but then the Nazis lose the war, and then there's chaos, and they don't want to go home, and the communists starting to take over. The communists take over the region, and then they there was a traitor. I mean, this is actually a really good piece of cinema where you can actually see the outcome of a single traitor. Of course, they simplify it for cinematic purposes, but there's one key traitor who gets bought off by the communists, and that actually caused major damage, because these people could have actually tried to defend themselves against the commies, but if you have these traitors within, I think he blows up an ammunition depot, and so they cannot hold out until help arrives.
Yeah, I'm thinking of another movie. Actually, I don't think I saw that movie. But yeah, so in Vietnam, so now get this. The Vietnamese started, so in 1957, they start this campaign of assassinations. So in I think it was 1957, they murder 60-something village leaders in South Vietnam. They just start assassinating local leaders.
Yeah.
And this, of course, makes the requirement of, Vietnam is, and Diem, and people thought, because, I mean, imagine the French just abandoned the country. Diem was a guy who was against the French colonializers. He was recognized by them as a brilliant administrator. He worked for them at times, but he says, I'm against you being here. Diem was very honest. He told the French, I want Vietnam for the Vietnamese. So he's a very honest person of integrity who wanted to build this country, build Vietnam, and to defend it against the communists. And people said he won't last a year. Mm-hmm. But he lasted 9 years. 9 years later, he was still there in 1963. But what the communists did, they started stepping up the violence. So when this violence began, now this relates to what the Chinese are doing to America, infiltrating America with their soldiers, which we're getting reports from. I've heard from Mr. Wang of Luda Media this is going on. This is what they did, the North did to the South. They took over 100,000 troops, officers and men, dressed them as civilians, smuggled them into South Vietnam to set up encampments. This became the Viet Cong, or the NLF, the National Liberation Front, which had the same name, by the way, in Algeria.
Yeah.
They called it the FLN, using the French,
It's almost about liberation, right?
Front Liberation Nationale, right? So, but it's the same. In English, it's the National Liberation Front. So they set that up. But it was just an extension of the North Vietnamese Army, the Communist Party. It took all of its orders from Hanoi. And so they were building these armies secretly hunkered down in the South. And these armies started. So then between 1957 and 69, this is what began as assassinations of village elders and leaders became the assassination of nurses, doctors, teachers, administrators at all levels. And they didn't, because the cities had good security, police, and army. It was the outlying villages. It was the outlying rural areas that didn't have the protection of the army that the communists were. There was this reign of terror where the communists were just murdering people wholesale. You are not a communist. You're in charge of a village. We're going to kill you. And you're a leader. Kill all their leaders so it can't succeed, because Diem was so successful in knitting the country together, creating an administrative system, a justice system, everything for Vietnam. It was succeeding so well, the communists were upset, because if this set in, South Vietnam would be a successful Western style, Asian country.
So why did this tension happen between Diem and the U.S. administration at some point?
That was this is the way they do it. And it goes to the fact of our addiction to television had set in by 1963. They realized Buddhism, well, let's make a religious war out of the fact Diem was a Catholic. And so a lot of the people around him were Catholics, naturally. And so let's make an issue out of this, even though nobody cared. Diem, when he was a provincial head, he worked with Confucianists and Buddhists, and they all loved him. He was just this benevolent guy who helped people.
Right.
As a leader. He was really good at that. Now, he was in the Asian set. They're not liberal Democrats in Asia, not in Japan or China, or they've got their own traditions, which there's discipline in their strictness, and they have rules. So the communists started infiltrating the Buddhists, and they were using the main pagoda in Hue, and they were getting their agents in. Their chief agent, and this is Margaret Higgins believed this because she interviewed him, and he basically admitted it to her. And she said that he was doing all these things on purpose. And she said, "What if I just write about this and tell people?" She says, "They won't believe you. Go ahead and write it."
Mm-hmm.
And of course, she said he was right. His name was Thich Tri Quang was his name, and he was one of the chief disciples of the leading communist Buddhist in the North. And his brother was the head of subversion of the South for the North Vietnamese Communist Party. So his brother was in charge of subverting South Vietnam. He was a disciple of the head communist Buddhist in the North. And so he had gotten into this main pagoda in Hue, and he was indoctrinating. And this is what he was telling everybody, what he was telling the Buddhists in South Vietnam. Diem is a Catholic. He's persecuting all the Buddhists. They're murdering Buddhists, and they would make up stories. There's a massacre of Buddhists in this village, and this one here, and this one there. And these Buddhists, these poor Buddhists, and Buddhism in Vietnam is different than Buddhism like in Japan, which was kind of militant and associated with the samurai and so on. The Buddhists really were pacifistic. They didn't believe in violence. But this so upset, this idea that this Catholic president was persecuting Buddhists, the communists duped so many Buddhists, monks and Buddhists, that they started a riot in Hue, a giant riot where 8 people were killed. And then they wanted the heads of the police that were involved in putting down the riot. And this was then proof given to the world. And so this was the event. This was in July of 1963. And of course, President Kennedy is there watching the TV like the rest of Americans. This was on American television. This Buddhist, in Hue, this 78-year-old guy, he got gasoline. A group of monks stood around him. They poured gasoline on him, and he tried to light himself with a lighter, but it wouldn't work. So somebody threw a match on him, and he burned. And they got it on video. And this guy slowly, and of course he was doped up. They had given him some kind of drugs. This is what witnesses said, so he wouldn't feel the pain. Right? They probably gave him a bunch of morphine or heroin or something. So he and it was horrific, right? And of course, what is the reaction of President Kennedy and all the people especially the State Department was the lead on this. U.S. State Department was, Diem is evil because this nice Buddhist just burned himself to death. Diem has to be oppressing Buddhists, because otherwise the Buddhists wouldn't do this. right? It never occurred to them, and this is what Margaret Higgins said, who wrote this fantastic book. Margaret Higgins was perhaps the best, one of our best journalists. She'd been a war correspondent she was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for being a war correspondent, or a foreign correspondent, rather. Our Vietnam Nightmare, this book she wrote, it was about the events of 1963, which really caused everything to spiral out of control in Vietnam. Um, she she was brilliant. She was very attractive, but she was very aggressive, and she could get interviews with anybody. She could talk to Bobby Kennedy, the president, President Diem. She could get in to see anybody, and she really was Johnny on the spot. In fact, in the Korean War, they said, "Oh, you can't have a woman correspondent at the front line," and General Douglas MacArthur said, "Oh no, this woman gets to be a war correspondent." Right? That's how charismatic she was. That's how brilliant she was. She was born in Hong Kong, and she actually spent time in Vietnam when she was a very little girl, but she was raised her family moved to Oakland, and she went to Berkeley, and ultimately went to Columbia University. And so she was a White House correspondent, which when she was in Vietnam, they thought that meant she was coming from the White House. She was representing President Kennedy. And this helped her to get interviews with some of these. She got an interview with Thich Tree Quang, that subversive Machiavellian Buddhist monk who was a communist agent. So it's an incredible story that he had basically swindled. He and his comrades had swindled the Buddhist community. And so now President Diem was trying to tell people, I'm not persecuting Muslims. I give them everything. Look, I apologize for the riot. This is a communist. But see, the mindset was, if you see it on TV, this burning monk, it doesn't matter what the truth is. And this is what the people in the State Department, many in the Kennedy administration, Dean Russ, the Secretary of State, was kind of neutral on it. But a lot of all the other State Department people said, we have to get rid of Diem, right? We have to get rid of him. So here's the Catholic president of the United States, first Catholic president, Kennedy, and he's being told to get rid of the Catholic president of Vietnam, Diem. And so Kennedy is eventually, in 1963, he's bullied into okaying a coup to remove Diem. And this is something Nixon knew about. I mean, this was kind of, the fact of Kennedy's involvement was hidden for a long time. And of course, I'm sure President Kennedy didn't know that Diem and his brother were going to be killed. And ironically, it was Diem's brother, who was one of the security chiefs within the South Vietnamese regime, who said that he knew Thich Tree Quang, that subversive monk, and he said, "Oh, I can talk to him. He's a reasonable guy." But get this. So Thich goes and says, "Oh, they're persecuting me." He goes to American ambassador, which was Henry Cabot Lodge, who'd been Nixon's running mate in 1960. He was the vice president. So Henry Cabot Lodge is the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, and this communist spy goes to the embassy and goes, "They're persecuting me. I'm a Buddhist. Take me in." So he's under the protection of the American ambassador. And when the coup happens, he comes out and he says, "Oh, you have to give the firing squad to the president's brother."
Oh, no. Oh, right? By the way, we should probably mention real quick that, at that time, the fairly young CIA was struggling very hard in many places in the world. I mean, the communist propaganda always portrayed the CIA as this monolithic, imperialist super agency who could do anything at any time, any place. But we have so many files now, and they've all been looked at. If Wiener spoke, about the CIA history, and the CIA was
Legacy of Ashes is that book. Yeah,
the CIA had so many problems because it was so young, it was so new. And some of these people they recruited from these elite universities in America, some of them had great potential, but it wasn't as mature, it wasn't as professional. So a lot of the reports that came out of the CIA were not worth the paper they were printed on, because source material source material oftentimes came from communist assets, and it was, every time there was a review, an internal review of the CIA's operation, the result was always so bad. They oftentimes kept these surveys secret because the performance was so bad.
And you had the issue that the head of the CIA in 1952 up until January 53 was, and I mentioned this before, was General Walter Battle Smith, who fell under suspicion of the FBI, and he had been U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union of being a Soviet agent.
Yeah.
And so much so that his file is still not, you can't get it. And he had his security clearance revoked so that he couldn't work in government after Eisenhower had kind of offered him a different job, tricked him into resigning as head of the CIA in January 1953. So yeah, the FBI is heavily infiltrated. It's being fed false information. At the same time, MI6 is heavily infiltrated. The prospective future head of MI6 is
Oh
Kim
yeah.
Philby, who's the British liaison in Washington at the time, having these lunches with James Angleton, who is trusting Kim Philby, right, with secrets. And James Angleton, then a major official in CIA counterintelligence. So you see that that the CIA and the British intelligence are just mulled out at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
So you have this as a terrible disaster already unfolding. So you have this disarray. So what happens in Vietnam then is that Diem is overthrown, and this is a disaster. And by the way, Diem is killed and overthrown a little bit less than 3 weeks before John F. Kennedy is shot. And we'll have to do a whole show
Shot by a
on the Kennedy
communist.
assassination. Shot by a communist. Yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. He had defected to the Soviet Union a couple of years before, after getting out of the Marine Corps, where he was known to talk about his Marxist ideas. And of course, there's a great book on this written by the former head of Romanian intelligence, Ion Pacepa, called "Programmed to Kill." And so so what happens is that the Kennedy assassination and the death of Diem and the disorganizing of Vietnam, because Diem was this brilliant genius organizer and governor of this country, and his government was disrupted by this phony baloney communist propaganda, fake news about him persecuting Buddhists. That's what did it. And the
Yeah.
Americans did it themselves. And the joke was, Higgins wrote in her article when she tried to expose this ruse, in an article she wrote about Thich Tree Quang, the nefarious communist monk, that she said, look, what the communists want and what Thich Tree Quang wants is basically is Diem's severed head, wrapped in an American flag and delivered up to the communists.
Yeah.
And of course, she said, I didn't know at the time I wrote that was what was going to happen later that year, right? In early November 1963. So this was the thing. So then, of course, these idiot people who hated Diem, these generals and other people, and the idiot ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, these idiots who'd gone along with this, getting rid of the Diem government, there was a mess because nobody had the political stature, right, to fill in for this guy. This guy's shoes were gigantic. How were you good? So the country was then going to start to fall, because who would trust anybody then? And who would trust the Americans? The Americans, if they knew the truth then, which some probably did, who would trust the Americans who would stab an ally in the back like this? This is horrific. And the communists did it by provocation. And what Higgins would say is, she would say, I would go to these people in the administration, and they'd say, it doesn't matter what the truth is. It doesn't matter that the communists provoked it. The TV image is
So
bad for the
powerful.
administration of monks burning themselves to death. We can't get behind that, right? So, and this is where you get Marshall McLuhan is saying at the time, the medium is the message. So TV, an image, the Chinese have the statement, an image is worth 1,000 words. Well, this was being applied. The image of the burning monk was worth, you could argue yourself till you were blue in the face that it was a communist provocation. And it's, no, that monk, that Diem has got to be bad. That monk burned himself because he was persecuted by Diem. And so then the communists did this sort of thing. And of course, meanwhile, while the supposed persecution of the by the Catholics of the Buddhists is taking place, what's really happening is the communists are murdering, butchering teachers, nurses, mayors of villages. They're killing people all over the country, and they're organizing the Viet Cong, this giant army of 100,000 troops, which are really North Vietnamese communist troops, as a supposed spontaneous rebellion
Mm-hmm.
in Vietnam, but it's just an infiltration. And they're
Yeah, just
ambushing police and they're ambushing soldiers out away from the cities, and they're trying to get control of the countryside and isolate the cities to force the country to surrender.
yeah, and it's a giant bush. I mean, so you can hide in the bush, and then you just pop out of the trees, and you have you do an assassination, or you ambush somebody, and then you disappear back into the trees, and you're gone. And yeah, this I
They
mean that
dug vast underground.
tunnels,
They did ant holes, ant
tunnels, yeah.
hills of tunnels. They tunneled all over the country and into the jungle. And how did they infiltrate? Vietnam is a narrow, long country. And the DMZ, the 17th parallel, it's one of the narrowest parts. I don't know, it's 50, 60 miles across. I don't know, maybe it's longer, but it's pretty narrow. And of course, there's artillery zeroed there. You can't get across it. So how did the North Vietnamese infiltrate a whole field army into Vietnam on the sly? Well, on the border of Vietnam with Cambodia and Laos, it's all jungle, just
Hmm.
thick jungle. And they cut a trail, they called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail, through Laos down into Cambodia along the whole length of South Vietnam, all the way down to the bottom of the Mekong Delta in the south. And they just infiltrated equipment, troops. They set up arms caches, just like something like Scott Gulbranson's claiming that the Chinese have done for 25 years through Mexico, running what Mr. Wang of Luda Media calls a Ho Chi Minh Trail through Mexico. They're sending he's claiming 2 Chinese field armies are being deployed inside the United States today. Well, this was what Ho Chi Minh and the communists and his Russian and Chinese advisors were getting him to do in South Vietnam in the late 1950s, early 60s.
Yeah, they're following a program. It's a
Yeah,
it's a handbook. Yeah, it's like a manual, so that you would just apply over and over again, like a
yeah.
a cooking
Infiltration
recipe.
warfare.
Like a
Yeah,
cooking recipe. And it's interesting to see that when you are today, when you're 40 years old, or you're younger than 40, or maybe you're in your 50s, what people, especially in Europe, what people in Europe remember about, or have seen on television and video and cinema, what people took away from Vietnam were these movies like Platoon, or movies such as Apocalypse Now, and it was always about the theme was always about the fall of the arrogant American imperialist pigs, so to say. So this was sort of that underlying theme that was spread all over the place in these movies, and so on and so forth. So how it's just why wasn't the American media offensive better? I mean, we talked about, I mentioned this on the show before. You talk about Star Wars, right? And the famous George Lucas, and he was sort of inspired by the Viet Cong, according to his own words, and the Viet Cong were the inspiration for the rebels in Star Wars. Now, of course, there's plausible deniability. He could always claim, well, the Empire in Star Wars is kind of like Britain, and the Empire in Star Wars is kind of like the Nazis, and so on and so. But there was still this current that the rebels in Star Wars are like the Viet Cong, and actually, George Lucas said that Soviet directors had more freedom to work. Soviet directors had more freedom to work than American directors. So it's like this thing in Star Wars of a gaggle of multicultural rebels taking on this white empire. So why didn't
yeah,
and
that's
even the
yeah.
background of George Lucas, he was sort of attached to the American Information Agency, which had the job of promoting America's image abroad. And George Lucas and some of the other famous directors of that era, they were attached to this information agency, and they did some smaller projects for someone who was in that information agency. But then he snuck through his Star Wars screenplay and he got the movie made, and this is what people remember. They don't remember anything of what you just explained, but they remember
Well,
Apocalypse Now and they
to
remember
be to
Platoon.
be fair, John Wayne made a movie in 1968 called The Green Berets, right? Have you ever seen that movie?
No.
Very anti-communist, showing the American special forces as heroes defending the local people against the atrocities of the Viet Cong. So much more true to the actual situation there. But it is true. The United States did not explain the war to the American people very well. They assumed everybody understood we were fighting communism. Um, and of course, the United States did not want to have to send troops. And I might explain the complexities of the Kennedy administration now. There's all these people claiming that Kennedy was assassinated by the U.S. military now. This is the more recent conspiracy theory because he was not for engaging in Vietnam. And this is kind of not true. I mean, Higgins mentions this General Maxwell Taylor that Bobby Kennedy told her, you got to talk to this General Krulak and talk to Maxwell Taylor. The Kennedys, when things were getting bad there in Vietnam in 1961, late 61, early 62, they set Maxwell Taylor on a mission to go find out what the truth was. And the reason the truth was so difficult in Vietnam was the way the communists had distorted even our own media. This is General Lane, Thomas Lane's book. I don't have the cover. It's America on Trial. It's about the Vietnam War. And Lane gets it right. He talks about the Vietnam, the Geneva, and the inception of the war. The discussion of policy has been so contaminated with lies and purposeful propaganda about the Geneva settlement of 1954 that some clarification is required to establish perspective. And he spends this whole chapter clarifying all the lies that the communists had put across to people about what happened there in Vietnam. And of course, so Maxwell Taylor goes over there to see that, because Diem is telling the Americans, I need your help. They're infiltrating. We don't know how many troops, but they're infiltrating us with soldiers and officers. They're setting up some kind of army inside our country. And we need special assistance. We need our army to be strengthened because their army wasn't. I mean, imagine that there's 100,000 soldiers pouring into your country dressed as civilians, infiltrating through the jungles on your flanks. And the Americans at first, most of the first year of the Kennedy administration, they were like, "Oh, he just wants money from us. Forget about it." But when Maxwell Taylor went over there, they saw the realities on the ground, and that's when they created Material Assistance Command Vietnam. 1962, I think it was created in February 1962. I'm trying to remember exactly. I think it was February. And the Material Assistance Command Vietnam was the entity under which it was like SHAEF, right, in Europe, Supreme Headquarters Allied. It became the American or Allied Expeditionary Forces, where not only American troops, but Australian and Republic of Korea troops. People don't realize there were South Korean troops in Vietnam as well, were in the country, trying to help to stabilize it, to try to restrict the movement of these infiltration tactics. And of course, Taylor said, yeah, it's serious. We have to do something. And of course, pour additional material in there. And of course, when Diem fell apart, they realized that now American air power and American troops were going to become necessary. So by 1965, you have the Tonkin Gulf incident, which the left makes all kinds of a big deal about it being
and
phony.
The truthers, yeah, that was always the thing when you look at conspiracy movement, these activists, and they made a big deal of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But according to them, of course, this was done by the grand Jewish conspiracy and the Elders of Zion. But that doesn't even make that doesn't even make sense in terms of that conspiracy narrative, because why would this grand Jewish globalist communist whatever conspiracy, why would they create an incident to fight communism. I mean, that doesn't even make sense within that false frame of what the conspiracy guys believe. But it was simply something that made America look bad or the government look bad, so that's what was used.
Well, and there's been distortions of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Look, we would be infiltrating commandos and maybe spies into North Vietnam by using amphibious operations. We had a big fleet. We controlled the ocean off of North Vietnam. And of course, this triggered the 135th Vietnamese torpedo boat regiment or battalion. I forget what they designated it. It reacted, and the USS Maddox fired warning shots, and there were actual, allegedly, but people say it didn't happen, attempted torpedo attacks on American warships. And of course, it was an excuse because we needed to go in because the country, we realized that it wasn't just 100,000 troops. They had these bases up and down the flank of Vietnam in the Cambodian and Laotian jungle from which the North Vietnamese army regulars could actually have troop buildups and then just outright invade the country. And of course, invading Vietnam along the 17th parallel is nothing because it's a very short front. Mm-hmm. You just put up artillery and bunkers and you stop them. But this is the whole country's exposed to invasion along its open flank. There's no defense. You can't defend, 1,000 miles of jungle-like terrain. And so it's like, oh my gosh, they could attack Saigon. Saigon isn't that far. Saigon's sort of in the middle south of the country. It's probably less than 100 kilometers to Cambodia, maybe 140 kilometers to Cambodia from there. You can move. The Ho Chi Minh Trail got so good you could move tanks. A North Vietnamese infantry division would have a tank, at least one tank battalion usually. So there wasn't just infantry. There were heavy weapons in these North Vietnamese divisions, and they had howitzers, and the lighter Viet Cong stuff couldn't because they were already infiltrated. They had to infiltrate in and get into the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta. That's where they mostly operated, was where they had more covering terrain in these places where there was more mountainous, more hills, more cover, more jungle. But this was, and so of course, we started sending troops in 1965, American ground forces. Now, probably we overdid it. And the way the targets were picked by the bombing was the Tuesday Lunch Club. It was ridiculous. And of course, there's a famous book called Victims of Groupthink by Irving Janis about how Johnson ran the war, along with Walt Rostow, who we need to talk about, he was a deputy national security advisor. They didn't call it then there. It was special advisor to the president. But he was basically deputy national security advisor to Kennedy and then national security advisor to Johnson. And Johnson once said he's the second most important person in the White House because he's running our national security policy. And there's a problem with Walt Rostow, which I will mention, which has to do with this book here, The Ordeal of Otto Otepka. Otto Otepka was the head. He was basically the deputy head, but he was really running the security department of the State Department, the security office of the State Department, which was mandated by the U.S. Senate to keep communists out of government, right? So they had these strict rules by the Senate to follow because in 1954, the Senate Security Committee had done these investigations, found these rules. This is when the Republicans controlled the Senate, and they passed all these security laws. They got about 20,000 communists out of the U.S. government. And of course, a very funny thing happened when the Kennedy administration came in. Dean Rusk, the prospective Secretary of State, and Bobby Kennedy, who was going to be the Attorney General, on December 12, 1960, went to see Otepka about Walt Rostow, getting him into the State Department in a sensitive position. And they sat down with Otepka and they said, why can't you have this guy in? He's great. He's an anti-communist. Mm-hmm. I know him. He hangs out with me and Jack, Bobby would say. And so Otepka, who had a great memory, said, oh, I know this guy. He's got a lot of personal friends who are communists, and some of them are KGB agents.
Oh, no.
His dad was in the same party. His dad was Russian, who left Russia, but he was part of Lenin's party, the Social Democratic Party in 1905. And he continued to be a socialist activist in the United States. And two of his dad's sisters, I think his aunts, were members of the Communist Party USA. And
Oh
then he
noes.
worked for, yeah. And so Tepicus said, look, this Walt Rostow, he got into the CIA program, and they had to kick him out because they investigated him, and he said, oh my God, he's got all these communist contacts, we can't have him. Then he tried to worm his way into an Air Force program. The Air Force Office of Intelligence investigated him and had to kick him out.
But he
So he
still
said, there's
got
no,
in
right.
through
Well,
the
what
political
happened
door.
was, yeah, he did, because you see, the White House, and this is true for Nixon and Kissinger, right? If you worked directly for the president, you didn't have to be vetted by those rules than if you worked in the State Department, because originally they wanted Rostow to work in this high level in the State Department. So Kennedy just made him his deputy, special advisor on security, instead, where Kennedy could waive the security rules for Rostow. Now, we don't have any, Otepika would say, we don't have any proof Rostow is a Soviet agent. We don't. There's no ever proof
But
of
he's
it.
too dangerous. It seems the likelihood is too high.
He's dangerous. The rules are you can't have somebody with these
Yeah, and
level of,
there's other
now,
people. I mean, you can pick somebody who's not that much of a risk.
right. Oh, absolutely. Look, it's like, not saying he's a communist, he's a security risk. We just can't have it because he might be.
Oh,
This is
maybe
the
we should
profile
mention.
of someone who might be.
Yeah, maybe we should mention real quick for people to understand this. Now, there are different levels of counterintelligence. So at some point, you may collect information and you say this person is too much of a risk. We don't have anything super solid on current espionage activities, but why take the risk? Is this like, this is sort of why this system was created of security clearances and just deciding. And you cannot, if you want to join the CIA or you start out at the CIA, they can kick you out at any moment, and you do not have the option to sue the government and sue your way back in. Now, if somebody tosses you out of a government program because of your religion or your skin color, then you have legal options. But if they consider you not good enough in terms of security, if they don't trust you enough, that's their choice. So that's kind of the first level. Why would you pick someone if you have other people who are less of a risk? Then the next thing is you actually can find out that somebody is a foreign spy, but you cannot really convict him of much in a court of law. Now, excuse me, this happened a bunch of times because to reach that next level of actually having somebody in court like the Rosenbergs, the atomic spies, that takes a lot of catching someone in the act, filming someone with a drop-off, or finding incriminating material hidden under the floorboards and the microdots and everything. So there are these different levels. I mean, if you can, convict someone in a court, that's of course the best possible thing, but oftentimes you just kind of can tell somebody's a spy. And sometimes you can assume somebody is just too much of a risk. So, because sometimes people, I see that so many times, when you talk about a specific individual and you voice all your suspicions and you voice all the background info you have gathered, some people will just reply, well, it's either black and white. Either you have perfect proof this guy is a spy, or you don't have that perfect proof. And if you don't have the perfect proof, we should just work with that person. And this doesn't make any sense
we should
whatsoever.
let him have all the secrets, right? If we don't have perfect proof he's a Soviet agent, let him see all the secrets.
That's not how intelligence works. Not at all. I mean,
No.
just to mention that.
Well, it shouldn't work that way. And here's the thing, where the Kennedy administration is this anti-communist liberal group of liberals, ostensibly. And like every administration, there's communist spies there somewhere. They're going to get in, right? And of course, it's like finding Waldo. Which one is the communist agent? Because they're there, right? You know that somebody's been blackmailed or somebody's been
compromised. Sometimes you need the haystack to find the needle.
Yeah, and of course there's a haystack there. So you have to have these. You have to be really strict and careful. And Eisenhower, one thing to Eisenhower's credit, if you read John Lewis Gaddis's book, The Long Peace, about the Eisenhower administration, is that Eisenhower had that. Okay, if we're going to fight, I'm going to blast you right out of this world. I'm going to nuke you. I'm going to anthrax you. If you
Yeah.
want a war, let's have it. But if you don't want a war, okay, we'd be glad to live in this peaceful coexistence that Khrushchev talks about. But otherwise, we're just going to have it out with you.
Mm-hmm.
So the communists were like, General Eisenhower, maybe we don't, and Eisenhower was a liberal Republican, but he was a soldier, and he figured this was his sort of personal way of dealing with it. When you get to Kennedy and they want to loosen the security rules, they want to get, actually, they start persecuting Otto Otepka. They ultimately go after his job. But what happens is that they stumble so badly fighting the communists, both in Cuba, as we will see, and we haven't got to Cuba yet, both in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Laos. The Kennedy administration basically is stumbling all over the place. Berlin, they stood up to Khrushchev in Berlin, but there's this problem that the liberals, because the liberals kind of it's kind of icky to fight and
Mm-hmm.
look at the burning monks, and this
Mm-hmm.
is all kind of icky. Maybe we can't, we're going to be the nice anti-communists. We're not going to threaten nuclear war like Ike did. And besides, and so Ike was more like following FDR, speak softly and carry a big
Big
stick.
stick.
And of course, under Eisenhower, it was they didn't have mutual assured destruction. They had massive retaliation. It was
Mm-hmm.
called, it was just massive. We're just going to massively
Smash him.
destroy you. And it doesn't, even if you annoy us, we might just massively destroy you.
Mm-hmm.
But you had Robert Strange McNamara as Secretary of Defense coming up with mutual assured destruction, MAD, right?
Mm.
And of course, it was ridiculous. Nuclear weapons are meant to be used not to smash, exchange, destroying each other's cities. They're meant to win a war by destroying the enemy's armies, military bases, nuclear storage facilities, and
Silos.
missile silos, and so on. And so it was they weren't the brilliant people around JFK weren't so brilliant.
Yeah.
In fact, they would have stumbled directly into a nuclear war in Cuba if it hadn't been that Kennedy separated himself from all these advisors who wanted to invade Cuba, not knowing there was 50,000 Soviet troops there armed with tactical nuclear weapons already in Cuba.
Yeah.
See, before they brought the nukes, they brought an army. Khrushchev had smuggled an army into Cuba. And so they found out later that if they'd gone in, that Soviet commander had the free use of nuclear weapons without asking permission from Moscow.
Oh no.
So if we dropped the 82nd and the 101st Airborne on Cuba, they would have been slaughtered,
Wow.
and they would have started use of nuclear weapons, probably. So it was a good thing that Kennedy did talk to Eisenhower, by the way. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
he got some good advice. I've got the tapes of the Eisenhower Kennedy talks during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I've got them. It's been some years since I listened to them, but they're really fascinating because during these tapes, Kennedy asked Eisenhower, he said, they promised me they weren't doing this, because they
Yeah.
did,
And also maybe we should mention real quick that, in America they had this gentleman kind of system. They had really nailed it down. So this was vastly different than what the Soviets had. Now with the Soviets, you had purge after purge after purge. Then you could be flying high one day, and the next day you're gone. I mean, even the closest, and we talked about this in the previous episodes, even the closest guys to Stalin, they could disappear, or they were always threatened. There was always the possibility that you're gone tomorrow. And so this was vastly different in the United States, and I think that had an impact on the general counterintelligence thinking. If somebody came in recommended, oh, we like this guy, he has the right attitude, and he knows this guy's wife, and they're all getting along fine, and it's all very gentlemanlike. It was sort of the strength of this American system, just having these people be civilized and talk to each other. This system had advantages, but you're going against an enemy, the Soviets, who would purge anybody at any given time, and nobody would trust anybody at any given time.
Yeah, the sanguinary discipline that you would kill people to make discipline work. Now, I should backtrack to the Algerian War, because there's something about this murderous technique of causing war and causing friction and causing tensions to increase that worked in Algeria. The Soviets, of course, were behind the Algerian Revolution against France. And of course, the French had this huge armies they ended up deploying. But how it escalated was at one point, the Algerian revolutionaries started attacking civilians, started killing
Yeah.
people. 49 here, 60 there, 30 there. And of course, what happens when you start murdering civilians? So you have this division in Algeria. You have the French, the Europeans in Algeria. You have the Muslims, and you have a division. And the French say, "Look, this is France. These Muslims can become part of us, or they can keep their ways and live, And there's a real religious racial divide in Algeria. So how do you turn this divide into something that and the French thought, well, we'll just police it and we'll just
Hmm.
make sure that they don't take over and we protect people. Well, once the Algerian revolutionaries start killing French civilians, and it's the French civilians are encouraged, of course, to arm themselves to defend themselves. But now there's posses of French civilians going out and doing reprisals on the
Yeah.
Muslims, killing innocent Muslims. So it becomes this ethnic dirty war where people are murdering each other. So you kill 150 French civilians, and the French civilians get so outraged they go back and kill 1,200 innocent Muslims,
Hmm.
right? This then then everybody, all the Muslims then join the FLN,
Yeah.
the Front Liberation National. They join it, and then it becomes enormous because there's more of them than there are the Europeans. And then the French are like, whoa, what do we do? How do we control this? And you see the communists were watching and learning the whole way, so that in Vietnam, if we kidnap, if we kill, if anybody retaliates on us, but in Vietnam, it didn't quite work. They didn't get the sympathy from the countryside that they wanted to. Most people, they could be terrorized into helping the Viet Cong, but they didn't
Hmm.
like the communists. They really didn't. In most of South Vietnam, in fact, many of them had fled the north already to come south. But and there are people that believed in communism too. Don't get me wrong. There are
Um, what about
ideological
the
communists.
what about this type of warfare that was done in Vietnam? Because I read this book on, I think this was a former executive of, it was either Shell, the oil company, and I mean, and he was observing some treasonous activity, like oil tankers that were able to, flying false colors. Basically, they were able to pass through and supply
Oh
the
yes, they. By the way, there wasn't just the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They actually were able to smuggle by sea
Yeah,
supplies down into the south of
exactly.
Vietnam, in the very south, in the Mekong area.
And
Yeah.
so he was observing that, and he was also talking about this. I don't remember who it was from the American side who said that we need to fight a specific type of war in Vietnam, because we cannot use a $100,000 or $50,000 bomb to destroy a hut that cost $50 to build. So we need to be very specific, adapt to the environment, and then just hit the communists precisely. But what was actually done was the United States built some sort of a mini Pentagon in Vietnam, and they're trying to make this into a large conventional effort. What do you think about that?
Well, this is what Nixon. See, Nixon was very intelligent in his analysis of the war. It's a shame that he had someone like Kissinger to be his Secretary of State. But Nixon, if you read Nixon's books, before, during, and after, and his speeches and so on, very intelligent, because Nixon understood that the removal of Diem had been a horrible mistake. And he also realized that the 1965 move by Johnson to take over the war, to Americanize the war. I mean,
Yeah.
you think about it, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was willing to fight. They needed equipment, they needed training, just like the Ukrainians do in Ukraine to fight the Russians. They needed all this stuff, and all we needed to do was do a really good job of providing that. and maybe give them some air support. But what we did is we panicked, we overreacted, we sent in ultimately half a million American
Yeah.
troops. And we Americanized the war. We took it over. We said, step aside, South Vietnam. We're going to fight the communists for you. This was stupid. And it was almost calculated to demoralize America, because America had a conscription army. We had a
Mm.
draft.
Mm.
So here's America in the prosperous 1960s,
These
and
kids.
you're going to be sending hundreds of thousands of Americans to Southeast Asia to fight a ground war against communists in the jungles.
Who know the
And
territory.
yeah, I mean, it's really calculated to sour Americans on the idea of actually opposing communism, which
Yeah.
is what it did. If Walt Rostow, as the war hawk of hawks, saying we're going to smash the communists, if we're going to move all these troops into there, if nothing could be calculated better to demoralize our side than this move, and to do it with all these promises, and then that harebrained McNamara saying we're going to win by body counts. He's a
Mm.
statistician. What do you expect a statistician to do? Well, we'll turn it into numbers.
Yeah. And
That's
also,
not how wars work either.
yeah. And then now, of course, we know a lot more about what went on the ground. The Americans, they used specialized encryption, specialized encrypted radios, but they were so huge and they couldn't function properly in that heat. So oftentimes these devices would fail to operate, and then somebody radioed some very sensitive information on an open frequency, and also with the espionage, knowing what the Americans were up to, that of course had a tremendous impact on that specific war that was fought with these conventional, these very conventional traditional means. And also, I mentioned this on the show before, when the war was over, some of these higher-ranking military officers of America and military intelligence people, they were quite frustrated and depressed because they didn't understand yet what we learned later with all the traitors and the all these moles that were giving away crucial information, like this one Navy guy. Who was that Navy guy again? Who was a Birch Society fan, and then he sold the secrets to the Soviets. I forgot
Oh,
his
you mean
name.
the Walker spy ring?
I think it was Walker. But after the war, these United States officers, they didn't understand yet how big the infiltration problem was. And one of the guys that I actually got to meet was, the later General Albert Stubblebine. And he was so depressed. And interestingly enough, he then got into some esoteric circles among the military, and they were doing things like using psychedelics to treat people with depression, and maybe General Stubblebine had been introduced to psychedelics. And it seems like a leftist attempt at influencing frustrated officers, especially after Vietnam, and then turning them from, very capable anti-communists, turning them into these half-truthers, esoterics, and
Again and again, yes, absolutely. So many came back with this disillusioned, since they thought that because the war was run badly in certain respects, they thought that our side was wrong. And they stopped being really about anti-communism, because the communists had so confused all the issues surrounding the war, that this is what happened. I should explain, too, that the use of drugs, narcotics, already a Friendship of Nations operation, which was to use drugs to undermine the United States, had been adopted in 1960. And of course, heroin was being used in Vietnam. It was being brought into the South. And all of America's intelligence, Army intelligence, Air Force intelligence, Marine Corps intelligence, Navy intelligence, was telling its people, stay away from drug trafficking, drug traffickers. The communists are trying to use this to double you, to compromise you, to turn you into a double agent. And of course, many did. and there's allegations about quite a few people who were in the CIA and other agencies. Later, a lot of people were kicked out of the CIA because of this, because they were seen to have been involved in the drug trafficking, which was meant that they were probably turned to being communist agents. So there was because the communists are so insidious, their tactics are so darn good. But it's funny, at the military part of it, they weren't all that good. And we should get into the Tet Offensive next, because here they had built up these giant, 15 to 20 regiments of troops, Viet Cong troops in these enclaves in the South, hiding with tunnels and special secret bases and so on, the secret rebel base, right, from Star Wars. And the Americans were, developing actually these tactics, which were vertical envelopment. That is, coming in with helicopters and landing on top of them and using massive firepower from gunships and bombers and just wiping them out. Very beautiful new forms of warfare in terms of defeating this kind of warfare. So the communists kind of met their match on the battlefield. And these first encounters with the Americans, we were just wiping them. But they were, this buildup, they were very carefully, 1965, 66, 67, they were trying to avoid a major battle. The communist armies would retreat and hide in the jungles and avoid battle. And then in early 1968, and that's a presidential election year, by the way, 1968, they launched this thing called the Tet Offensive. And of course, it's this holiday for the Vietnamese that's kind of like New Year's and Christmas and Thanksgiving, and everything rolled into one. And of course, people thought, oh, they wouldn't attack then because it's this special holiday for Vietnam. And yet, this was exactly when they were going to launch their big attack. They had, dozens of divisions staged at bases outside Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, ready to flood into the flanks. They had the Viet Cong primed, and the Viet Cong were the fattest and most heavily armed that they ever were. I mean, it was you look at the order of battle and you go, how can the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and the Americans survive an attack like this? It was huge. It's over 300,000 troops. It's a surprise attack on a holiday. It's using flanking. They can surround all these places right away. But American firepower and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which did most of the fighting, did a great job. And it was a slaughter of the Vietnamese, of the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong never recovered from the horrific losses they took. But in the American media, Walter Cronkite, all these other people, they depicted it as our defeat because we've been in Vietnam now, since 1962 technically, and we hadn't won yet. And look at this, the biggest offensive of all has come, when the American commander in Vietnam had said, General Westmoreland had said, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I remember as a kid, I saw them satirizing General Westmoreland with the light at the end of the tunnel as the headlamp of an oncoming train. Right. So it's like, no, it's not over. We can't do this. It's so huge because the fighting, it was the bloodiest. I mean, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions suffered something like 30-40% casualties.
Wow.
In the year 1968. I think it was actually higher for the 1st Marine Division. I mean, it was bloody, more 58,000 Americans died and tens of thousands more wounded in the war altogether. But that was the bloody year. And of course, when you win big victories, you suffer lots of casualties. American airborne troops took heavy casualties, but we won this tremendous battle. And the communists had to go and lick their wounds. They weren't able to mount an offensive again until 1972, 4 years later. But it was a weak, shadow of the Tet Offensive. And there were no American ground troops fighting in 1972. We just used our air power. But the Army of the Republic of Vietnam defeated them handily in 1972, as long as we supplied them and we provided some air support. And so the Vietnam War, I mean, effectively Nixon, and see what Nixon did is he called it Vietnamization of the war. That is, give the war back to the Vietnamese. So they're fighting it. So Americans aren't dying. we can provide the material assistance that originally was conceived with Material Assistance Command Vietnam and the air support when needed. And that worked perfectly fine.
Yeah.
The Vietnamese, South Vietnam was a secure country. And of course, in 1971, there was to destroy these bases, to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the bases, Nixon invaded Cambodia and Laos. But of course, it was done secretly with the agreement of the Cambodian government
Yeah.
because Cambodia had already been invaded by communist armies. We
And
weren't
overall,
invading it. It isn't.
yeah, and
But Nixon was accused of invading Cambodia
yeah, and
and
overall,
widening
I
the
mean,
war.
this was the second time in a row that the West had put this line in the sand and just very much sent that statement. You know, we talked about the Korean War and then, of course, Vietnam. So the communists probably expected this to be a done deal. They will roll through. They will march through these countries and declare victory and grandstand and send that signal worldwide that so-called liberation movements could be successful everywhere. So this is like the Star Wars moment or the Star Wars romanticism that, you know, no matter where you are in the world, you can have that liberation if you collaborate with Moscow. And so in terms of that, and also the overall American military budgets and you know, the advancement of NATO and all of that, that sent a pretty strong signal. So we're not gonna just watch these things unfold. You know, we're just gonna have this show of force. And I think that in terms of that, specific goals and actually had been achieved.
Yeah, yeah. The Vietnam War was this watershed when people realized, Nixon had handled it right, but so then you had to go after Nixon, which is where Watergate comes along. And of course, Nixon, the left had never forgiven Nixon for being an anti-communist, for basically standing up for Whittaker Chambers when he was a congressman, and Whittaker Chambers was testifying against Alger Hiss. And everybody was ready to throw Chambers under the bus and say, oh, Hiss can't be a communist. We can't have a communist at this level in the State Department. After all, he was at the founding of the United Nations, he was the founding General Secretary, acting General Secretary of the United Nations. He can't be a communist spy, but he was. He was a communist spy. And Nixon had the courage. That's why Nixon became vice president under Eisenhower, the courage he showed standing up for Whittaker Chambers. That's ultimately why Nixon became president, because of his reputation as an anti-communist.
Yeah.
And so the left was never going to forgive Richard Nixon for that. Even though Nixon had considerably mellowed and softened, he was still determined to defend Vietnam and Cambodia. And of course, Cambodia was drawn into the conflict because the North Vietnamese armies were moving through Cambodia to flank Vietnam, and the Cambodian government, because it was a scandal, was keeping it a secret. Cambodian people were not told by their government, North Vietnamese divisions are moving through our territory in the jungles there on the east side of our country to invade Vietnam. They didn't want to antagonize the North Vietnamese because they might turn and invade Cambodia, right? And
Yeah.
Cambodia wasn't ready. So the United States ended up supporting both Cambodia and Vietnam as the war widened. But this was depicted as Nixon's widening of the war, not that the communists had widened it already.
Yeah, and how about these student protests at the time? You know, Vietnam, and then of course the Nixon Watergate
This
scandal.
is what we see, of course, today with the
Yeah.
Hamas the crazy protests. I saw the footage at Humboldt State University, where I used to live just around the corner from there. And I saw the violence against the policemen trying to get them out of some kind of office they'd occupied. And oh my gosh, the rage. And it's the same during Vietnam. I remember I was 10 years old in 1968, and I was sort of a baffled 10-year-old looking at these older teenagers at their behavior, because a lot of us, America was very different. You know, you get before 1965, it's a very America. You can't imagine how patriotic, the feeling of unity. We defeated the Nazis in World War II. it just had this feeling of this invincible, beautiful country. And then this, oh, America's ugly, the ugly American. There's all these, we're on the wrong side, we're imperialists.
Now
All
we're
of
the
this
bad
stuff,
guys.
we're the bad guys, right? And this is suddenly is emerging with this younger generation. This generation, by the way, that was born after the war, the baby boomers, born after the war, living, in this
Peace.
paradise, really, this economic paradise. Their upbringing with TV and all the toys you could want, right?
Afford houses and cars
And
and
nice
vacations.
houses, and yeah, I mean, it was America was this paradise, right? Compared to any country, I mean, the standard of living shot through the roof, especially in the 1960s. You have the series Happy Days in America in the 1970s
Mm,
depicting life in the 1950s. It was this idyllic moment, and then all of a sudden this Vietnam War, and everything's bad in America. Everything is wrong. America's horrible. It's not just anti-McCarthyism. And you've got Louis Boudin's wrote a book in 1965 saying, oh, the communists are poised for victory because Hoover, nobody's listening to J. Edgar Hoover anymore. Nobody's listening to anti-communism
yeah.
anymore. They have got you by the short hairs and you don't even know it. And of course, it was true.
Yeah.
We weren't solid anymore.
I recently read that book from this was Wiener's book about the FBI. He also wrote that book about the CIA. But in this FBI book, he describes a situation when these left wing terrorist circles in America, they suddenly disappeared from the radar of the FBI. So they quickly had adapted, new spycraft. So we can probably guess where they got that new level of spycraft. Most likely from the Soviets, and so this is when the FBI had to break into places and plant listening devices. And I think that the legal apparatus was just behind, because you can still have a constitution, you can still protect people's rights, but once people resort to terrorism or they have this explicit plan of working towards a Soviet takeover, and you have these assets in America collaborating with the Soviet Union, with a foreign power, I mean, of course, the intelligence community, needs to be able to counter that. But when the legal system really was behind, it wasn't really suited for that new situation. The FBI did these break-ins, and ultimately when Nixon fell because of a very simple operation, really, the Watergate break-in. This was just kind of an example of a larger problem, because the Americans, they had the Weathermen terrorists. We in Germany, we had the RAF. Now, maybe some people in America have seen the footage of so-called student protests in Western German universities. It was crazy. These lecture halls or these buildings, they were stuffed full of people waving these
And they were
flags.
in 1968, by the way, in terms of these protests, didn't just happen in America on American campuses. They happened in France and Paris and Germany, all over the Western world.
Yeah,
In the main countries, this happened. And these protests were, I mean, at Kent State, the National Guard fired on students,
yeah,
right, with
yeah.
live rounds of ammunition. So there were people killed. So this was a very serious and divisive thing. And the communists did it, just like they used the fake
Yeah.
Buddhist thing to divide
I think the
people.
only thing that America didn't experience is what we had, which was when the RAF, the Red Army faction, these leftist terrorists, they started to kidnap very powerful individuals and had these mock trials. They were just assassinating people. Every few weeks or months, you would have a new headline. A powerful person was kidnapped or murdered, and
Yeah, we
also
had the Patty Hearst kidnapping by the Symbionese Liberation Army. That was
the
as close as we had to
the
somebody
what?
powerful being kidnapped. Yeah, Patty Hearst, the Hearst newspaper, conservative, right wing, anti communist newspaper. Patty Hearst was kidnapped, and then she ends up through the Stockholm syndrome robbing a bank with them,
Oh,
right? So she sort of becomes one. It's a strange story, but so we had a little bit of that here in the U.S. We also had the Weather Underground, which did bombings. So we did have bombings here in the
yeah.
U.S. Um, and killings, and we had the Black Panthers in Oakland,
Oh, yeah.
who were very ultra violent, and of course were spreading
Maoist.
their. And so we had the communists tried to use. They wanted to make a race war in America that we should talk about by recruiting Black Americans by using this. We have, whenever there's a cleavage in society, whenever there's a break in human beings, a division between human beings, the communists can pour salt on those wounds rather than healing them, rather than making it
Yeah.
so that people can love each other and get
Yeah,
along, making it worse.
that's another reason I think why socialists they try to find a way into different communities, using social workers and all kinds of people, because not only can you influence the target audience, but you could also understand the psyche of the group you are trying to get mad. Because if you work in a black community as a social worker and you have all these communist connections, you can see up close how these people think, how they grew up, what their mindset is, and that's something that goes back to the early days of the mid 1800s in Germany, when the communists actually basically stole the early psychological research and even the early psychometrics, that is measuring a person's personality, having different attributes and then assigning a number. How much is this attribute expressed in that person? And the communists, they knew about what they call the authoritarian personality. This was the enemy. If somebody had these characteristics, you couldn't work with them. This was the enemy. But if somebody had these other characteristics, you can recruit them or you can draw
Yeah,
them to your
the
side.
Frankfurt School did that authoritarian personality thing, didn't they? That was
Oh yeah.
them.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was
Um,
stolen. It was basically stolen from these German very early psychologists in the mid
and of
1800s.
course the German communists after 1848, many of them came here. Many
Yes.
settled in northern Missouri, and some of them fought in the Civil War. But you had again in World War II, like the Frankfurt School, coming to the United States, getting into U.S. academia, so that you have these professors like Horkheimer and others that are of this, spreading these ideas on our campuses to where we've made they've got all these mini me's now,
Yeah.
and it's more virulent, it's more intolerant,
Yeah. And
it's not, yeah, it's not liberal at all, it's communist,
I think
basically
yeah, I think
totalitarian.
I think that quite a bit of anti-communist media in America and overall structures, I think a lot of it was too simplistic, because when I look at certain groups, especially the ones that groups that bought radio stations and they had these radio programs and the book market, and they had a fairly large audience, but the message was extremely simple. It was about go to church, get married, have children, be patriotic. And it was so simplistic, while the communists ran this very sophisticated system, guided by some of the leading psychologists, really. And so by understanding that psychology, I think that's what made communist socialist propaganda so successful. Nowadays, you see Tucker Carlson talking about the UFO stuff, and he likes people who are fascinated by the UFO stuff, and he's open to flat Earth, you know, ideas, and he's open to everything that is believed by people who are unhappy and frustrated. And it's just like, we understand. I mean, if you analyze it, why some people are psychological reasons why some people are interested in UFOs and aliens and flat Earth and traditional conspiracy media, we can really deconstruct it and see where this comes from.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that's what made the communists so successful, because a lot of the um, anti-communist media, it was just too simple, probably.
Well, that's a good point. Look, when I was in graduate school, political science is a long tradition, and I have readers that will say to me, "Well, they're political science, social science. That's not science. That's just baloney." Not really true. If you've actually been there and done that, and you've studied philosophy of science, it's not true. You've got people like Max Weber. You've got uh, people like Gustav Le Bon, who was a scientist in
Yeah.
in the physical sciences, who also went into social science. There is science, and there is philosophy. There is advanced knowledge and techniques, and by being anti-intellectual and by abandoning advanced concepts and techniques, the right is basically giving up its weapons to the left,
Yeah.
so that the universities are under control of them. All the advanced methods of subversion and construction of institutions or misconstruction, all the information warfare tools are in their hands. And now who's being manipulated by who? These simple people are now the victims on the right of a very sophisticated communist propaganda that's masquerading as conservative patriotism.
Oh yeah, yeah. And
It's
this is the thing.
astonishing.
This is the thing when scientists did these experiments with animals. They were using chickens and other, primitive animals, and they were trying to find out what they actually were triggered by. What made an animal
Behaviorism,
behave.
Pavlov's
Yeah,
dogs.
especially what makes an
Pavlov
animal.
worked by the way, worked with Soviet intelligence.
Yeah, so what makes
So a
an
lot of
animal
his, yeah.
consider another creature an enemy or a friend? So they could introduce a another friendly animal, but they would play a certain sound, or they would introduce a certain smell, and then your test animal would consider the other animal an enemy, even though there was no threat. Same thing, you could fool an animal into believing another animal was peaceful by introducing certain sounds and smells. And so if you
By the
take.
way, they also found out that if you confuse the animal's instincts by giving mixed signals, you get the animal used to the sound of the bell causing
Yeah,
salivation, and you get the animal's expectations, and then you start confusing the signals. So the animal is confused and doesn't know what anything means anymore.
yeah,
The animal literally goes nuts and becomes hostile and alienated.
yeah,
And I should just point this out, that the key insight that Eric Voegelin, the German American philosopher, he pointed out that the origin of totalitarian ideology and the raw material of totalitarianism is from alienated people. That is, people who are literally made crazy
mm,
by not being able to correctly interpret their environment or understand their reality.
yeah. And so by having this oversimplified anti-communism for a long time during the Cold War and after the Cold War, if you have these very, very baseline ideas and not give any deeper insight and not teach people how to develop insight into themselves and others, if it's kept so simple, that made it then possible, especially after 1991, it made it possible for the Russians to camouflage themselves as conservative, because people are just looking for the outward signals. They have a Christian church in Russia. It's a state-run, large Christian church in Russia, so they must be the good guys. Or they talk about their 1,000-year empire, so that sounds conservative. And so people, they judge who's an enemy and who is, friendly. They judge it by these outward signals that are being sent. And this is not how you should do anti-communism. If
No,
it's
in
condescending, it's
fact,
condescending to the audience. It seems like you're considering the audience to be stupid, so you don't want to confuse them with too complicated things. So
right.
you keep it nice
Well,
and simple. But
this is the problem actually with mass democracy. half the population is under 100 IQ. You have to bring everybody along. And the fact is people with average intelligence oftentimes have these difficulties. Plus, people have their attention divided between their work and their family life. And so they don't have the attention to do this. And when the normal structures are breaking down, so you have this kind of thing that President Diem said this to Margaret Higgins when she interviewed him. He said that the communists do battles, but sometimes it's all about what he called moral attrition.
Yeah.
They're always trying to morally attrition you away. It's a brilliant kind of insight about how they work. And that moral attrition is meant to alienate you and make you vulnerable and make you crazy so you'll believe the next lie because you become so frustrated. I mean, now it's understandable. All these people on the right, because there's so many lies that are being told to us. So many of the things that we've believed, like the fall of the Soviet Union or what happened in Vietnam, right? Or the story about Senator Joseph McCarthy being bad when all those things they accuse him of were done to him. So all of these lies, you stack up all these decades of lies that people actually, they believe those lies. They go, oh yeah, McCarthy was bad. You know, we can't have McCarthyism. Oh yeah, Vietnam was wrong. I had a Catholic priest tell me, oh, Vietnam War was nothing about communism. Vietnam War was there were these tribal groups and communism was just used as a tag. You know, it was a tribal conflict. You know, so they have all these things they've been told that are not true that they end up believing, and then you stack them. You stack all these lies, and then pretty soon you're so disoriented that you can have a guy like Tucker Carlson who can't, you know, literally, how are you go back to school and relearn all of your history, that all of this was untrue, and try to piece it together? He cannot now identify his friend from his enemy. What is a creature that can't tell friend from foe? That is a sad creature, and that is a creature that is completely defenseless.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that a couple of days ago that Alex Jones, you know, famous conspiracy influencer, he bought, or his wife bought, a bunch of acres of land almost at the border to Mexico. You know, this is sort of an area where even I think the Unabomber spent some time, or one of the famous one of these
I thought the
famous.
Unabomber was in Montana, hiding out in a shack in
No,
Montana.
was one of these infamous guys that lived there for a while. It's sort of a community. It's sort of a community that's almost at the border to Mexico.
Mm.
And I heard Jones talk a lot about, you know, how bad it is in the border region because of all the illegal immigration and the militant drug cartels and so on. So why would they buy this large property right next to the border, you know, to Mexico? I mean, it's like
to flee on a moment's notice to get away.
One thing that came to my mind is just escape if things get too hot, and the other thing is something that I remembered from, I think it was the Heinz Felfe case. He was a high-ranking member of West German foreign intelligence.
Yeah.
And he turned out to be one of the worst traitors and worst moles ever. And of course, he was paid many, many times incrementally by the Soviets. And he used that money, and I think he bought a piece of property that was almost at the border to Austria. So it would be a convenient cover for him to spend some time, you know, some free time at his, you know, at this other property. But then he could take the train and be in Austria very, very quickly to meet his handlers, right?
Or he could just take a little hike over the border, right?
Yeah, one of the local trains.
If he had to escape,
slow moving trains. You know, nobody thinks, you know, you look out of place, and you just go over the border, and meet your handlers. So we've had these cases, and of course that makes me speculate about Alex Jones because I mean, he's been so prolific when it comes to, you know, looking at history and distorting a piece of history.
Oh
to
yeah.
make it part of that overall narrative that America is an occupied country, America needs to be liberated with foreign help, um, and this would be fighting communism, or because communism goes back to the, according to him, to this Rothschild conspiracy, this age
Mhm.
old conspiracy
Yeah.
idea.
Well, misidentifying the enemy is one of the key things in their strategy, in their psychological warfare strategy. You have to get people, if it's true, this is going back to Carl Schmitt in his book. Carl Schmitt made the proposition that the most important fundamental distinction in politics is the friend-enemy distinction. It is the political distinction.
Yes.
That if you don't have friends and enemies, you don't even have politics, right? Different degrees of enmity and disagreement. So the friend-enemy distinction is the key one. And so, and Chairman Mao, after he read Schmidt's book in 1927, he wrote an essay, a very famous essay, in which Mao said, the most important thing in politics is know who your friends are and know who your enemies are.
Yeah.
And of course, that's exactly true. This is profound. Coming from a communist, it's true. Know who your friends and your enemies are. And of course, what would then be a key strategy if you want to win? Make sure your enemy doesn't know who his enemies and friends are.
Mm-hmm.
Make him completely disoriented and confused.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Frankfurt School. Okay, so these high-level social scientists, psychologists, started in Germany, went to the United States. Some of them came back and, had a great role in making people more communist in Western Europe. Now, the Frankfurt School obviously is painted by these truthers as part of the Illuminati Jewish conspiracy, right? So this is anything significant is painted that way, of course. But first of all, it's applied psychology, and second, if you look at these individuals, Adorno, Marcuse, and all these others, if you look at their writings, they show their hatred for the Enlightenment. So it's classic communist thinking. They say that the Enlightenment, or just the very idea of the Enlightenment was stupid, because you have capitalism and you have authorities and elites and basically hierarchies. Everything needs hierarchies. But then he compares it to socialism and says that socialism is the real thing, and this is kind of the real order of what it should be. So you have all this very clear in that language, but it's painted as an American sort of Illuminati Jewish conspiracy. And nowadays, of course, these truthers say the Russians will help us to end wokeness, because this is now, of course, a major issue in politics. The general wokeness, the craziness among the younger generations, and this being the result of the Frankfurt School, the truthers say, well, this wokeness and the Frankfurt School is Illuminati Jewish, they think. So we need the Russians, who they think are Christian and conservative. They need to help. We need their help to destroy the wokeness. But they don't even understand where this comes from. They haven't really looked at this thing.
They don't know that this started in Russia and it started with the communists, and they don't know that. And of course, the problem that we have then in constructing everything is you have a civilization, you have an order. It's not perfect, right? Nothing's perfect. We're trying. We've got a pretty good thing going here. It's better than a lot of periods in history. People live better. They have more opportunities. There's more knowledge. You could go, books are cheap. You can learn anything you want. You can train to be anything you want. There's amazing healthcare. I mean, the biggest growing demographic in America is people over 80, because people are living so much longer. So this is an amazing time to be alive, and it's capitalism. It's capitalism and freedom, mostly freedom, that has allowed people to flourish. Because if you give people freedom, they are, wow, I can do that. I can be what I want. I can, and it works. Communism is no, the state is going to tell you what you're going to be. And those evil people over there, we have to wipe them out. It's a war against civilization because it's not perfect. And here they're taking Clausewitz's war of extremes to the extreme. They're saying because it's not perfect, we have to attack it, and because it's going to fight back, we have to use the most ruthless means possible, and that means murdering people, and therefore we need to actually murder people to get them to murder people to get more people to join us, and to split
Yeah.
society. And the more split society is, yeah, the more we can do it because we're infiltrating them, and nobody really, everybody wants the war, and it's like, well, you can have peace, we can stop the war, because they're manipulating both sides, right? Because they started the war and then they're
Yeah.
infiltrating their enemy.
And
So
now,
then you just surrender to us and you can have peace.
yeah, and now we see the same handbook applied yet again. Now it's the Ukraine war. There's also four possible or four fronts that have been prepared against Israel through Iran and of course the Russians. And so the same handbook is applied. You see the university protests now in America, for the Palestinian cause. Of course, the Palestinians are run by the KGB, and they have been run by the KGB for many, many, many decades. Mahmoud Abbas and Yasser Arafat, and they, of course, Mahmoud Abbas, he basically promoted within an anti-Semitic text. This was his academia career. He had a
I mean,
Soviet
he went to
handler.
Moscow State
Yeah,
University,
the
and
Soviet
and
handler, and he writes,
he was trained in Russia, just like
yeah,
Yasser Arafat
and they
was.
believe in the elders of Zion myth, and they got fed all the
Mhm.
same stuff, and of course this campaign against Ukraine, saying it's not a real country. It's not our war. We shouldn't get involved. We should hang them out to dry. It's better the Russians have it than the elders of
Yeah, they're
Zion.
they're corrupt, right? Just like
Yeah,
they said, yeah, the South Vietnamese government is corrupt. We shouldn't support a corrupt government. Yeah, like the communists aren't murdering bastards, that do what much worse.
yeah.
It's like, the fact is, Alex, you and I don't deserve to exist because we're not perfect. So let's murder us. Let's kill ourselves because we're not perfect. That's the communist argument. Society's not perfect. We have to eradicate everything and start over again.
Yeah, and we see.
Oh yeah, well, what makes you perfect? How can you make? And of course, the society they create is
Yeah,
just a bucket of crap.
and the leftist system is it was so geared towards tension that they're not even immune against it themselves. And we saw that recently with what the CAS review on transgender youth. This was sort of a meta study that was being done, showing that most children, according to the studies, most children will grow out of it if you just let them be, and they will later no longer think they are in the wrong body. And they had even identified gaps in the data. So a lot of these trans youth, they will start a transition. They will get on the puberty blockers, then they will get on some of these other hormones, and maybe even first surgery and second surgery. But at some point in the middle of this transition, they just drop out. They don't think it's the right way to go, but now they have to live with the consequences of what's already been done to them. But they drop off the radar because some of these clinics, they don't follow up on these people that drop out. So when confronted, they always said that, well, barely anybody is regretting transitioning, but now we find out that's actually a major problem. And so when this study came out, the world famous author J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling felt vindicated because she's been battling these woke brigades for a long time, and there was even this new law in Scotland where she lives that said if you criticize or misgender anybody, this could land you in jail. But then J.K. Rowling threatened, I will go to jail. I want to see them put me in jail and then see what the reaction is going to be in the world. And so they backed down. They didn't arrest her. And but J.K. Rowling herself is actually a leftist, or she believes she is, because she was influenced by Jessica Mitford, who was called the red sheep of the family. It was an aristocratic family. And so Rowling is now a bit older. So she was a classic leftist decades ago, and now she's confronted with the new generation of woke leftists, and this new generation hates her because still in her books there's traditionalism, there's old mythology, kind of a the love of the style of the old Britain. And families, there's a very strong, because when you're a parent, you eventually you will have to watch the movies and read the books to your children. And so there's a very strong current in the Harry Potter world, a very strong current of family and tradition. So every main character is tied to a very traditional family. And so the leftists just decided to hate all that and just attack J.K. Rowling for not being woke enough. And it's like
Because
this Frankfurt school, these people eating themselves at this point.
yeah, well, you see, revolutions devour their own children, right? So you have to become more and more radical, because really it's about destruction, and it's about rejecting it's a revolt, not just against supposedly an establishment. It's a metaphysical revolt. It's a revolt against the given. And that means it's a revolt against identity. And you will notice that with the transgender thing and with all of the confusion, they say that narcissism is an identity disorder where you reject your true self.
Yeah.
That's really what's at the bottom of narcissism. Well, that's at the bottom of feminism, a woman trapped in a woman's body. Oh, how terrible. If you look at feminists, what are they for? Women being mothers? For women doing the things that women are made for? No. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Well, is it a woman if it doesn't need a man? If it is a man, is it a man if it doesn't need a woman? I mean, they're destroying identity. They're destroying the given. So that it's a much deeper malady. It's a metaphysical, it's a deep philosophical rejection of everything as it is. As if you could be God, erase the horizon, get rid of everything, and you get to create and start all over. So you get to make yourself, if you're born a woman, you get to make yourself a man, because the given is wrong. We reject what's given, what's been created already, what's already here, what I am. And the thing is that we are limited beings, human beings are. And so we don't make ourselves in that sense. We didn't make the human body. We didn't make society. It was all here before we were born. We're part of something, and we're limited, and we have, within that, we can be creative to an extent, but we have to acknowledge identity. And see, this is where the communists use the contradiction of different identities, like Algerian Muslims and Algerian French, and get them to, you can't exist together. You're opposites.
Mm-hmm.
There's a contradiction. So you have to now annihilate each other. And see, that's annihilate all of Europe this way. And so now Russia gets to own everything.
But no more of this tension once the revolution is finalized. When the new order is established, you're not supposed to do that activism thing where you get everybody mad at each other. It's quite the opposite. Everything has to run through these state organizations, and they tell you what to think and what the ideology is. And if you deviate from that, the secret police will pick you up in the middle of the night. We saw the famous climate activist Greta Thunberg taking up the Palestinian cause, and she, I read into her life and how she had this mental disorder. She couldn't eat food. Her sister couldn't bear many sounds, so this was a kind of a nightmarish situation. This was not a normal family. And little Greta in school, she was not accepted, and so she basically has no sense of community with average society. So she probably dislikes average society. And when she took up this Palestinian cause, This was around a time when her new book came out, and this is not from her actually. This is an essay collection of various known authors, and they have these gimmicks. They call it the what are they? The donut economy, when they have like drawn up like a cycle, and it's all based on natural resources and the environment, but it's socialism. It really is socialism. You're just attaching a naturalist, template and just have that as an entry point into socialism. So this is kind of a standard Leninist interpretation that we see from Greta Thunberg, if she realizes this or not, by taking up a Palestinian cause. This is kind of what the what we talked about with the liberation movement. So anybody who's controlled by Moscow, like the Palestinians, anybody who's controlled by Moscow is a freedom fighter, and it's a liberation movement. So she attaches herself to that supposed liberation movement, even though she wouldn't want to live in Palestine. She wouldn't want to live among those Muslims because she would have no rights. She would have no rights to complain and do activism against what she finds to be a problem. And it's like she created this following, with this climate topic, with this climate topic, and now she's using it to get people into rooting for Palestinians that are controlled by Moscow.
Yeah,
With this.
yeah. We should now. We're going to need to cover get up to Galitzin's defection and, of course,
Oh
the
yeah, the
Kennedy
French.
assassination.
Yeah.
We probably need to do that next week because we're getting towards the end of today. But I should cover further shenanigans. What happened in 1956? The British and the French tried to take. You had the Nasser regime in Egypt, and they. Nasser was tilting towards the Soviets, came in to help Nasser. And of course, there was this competition between America, and this is going to become important later, America and the Soviet Union over the Arabs. And this is why the Americans were shy of helping the French in Algeria or supporting them, because we didn't want to, we had Arab friends. And we really weren't really big in supporting Israel either. In fact, in 1956, we rather went against them because Britain and France aligned with Israel to attack Egypt. The Israelis call it the Sinai War. They came down and took the Sinai from Egypt. While the French and British landed, they were going to take the canal because the French and British built the canal. And they thought, Egypt shouldn't have it. We made it. It should be ours. And of course, the Eisenhower administration was thinking, oh my gosh, are we going to support an invasion of Egypt by our allies? This is, wrong. This is imperialism, right? And we don't want to be seen by the Arab world to be for imperialism, European imperialism. So we basically stuck a pin in this thing. So and this soured the British. The British basically got out of the business of helping us, east of Suez, especially.
Oh, Mountbatten screwed that up too. Lord Louis Mountbatten screwed that up.
Was he
too.
involved in the Suez operation in
'56?
Egypt. Wow. It's, and of course the Israelis I talked to an Israeli paratrooper that was in that war some years ago, and he said, yeah, the Egyptians just they weren't very good at war. They weren't at that point. The society wasn't organized in a modern way, and the Israelis just basically defeated the Egyptians very quickly. And he said he remembered he saw a pile of boots that was a giant mountain of boots, because all of the captured Egyptian soldiers, they didn't like boots. They lived their life barefooted. So they took the boots off and threw them away and walked back home without the boots. It was an interesting story. But at the same time, something happened in the communist world that we need to talk about. And it's the 1956 rebellion uprising in Hungary. There was the people in Hungary were more and more upset at communism. And at the end of the day, one day, the people coming out of work, this group rage, this mob sort of formed. Everybody just at once, they went to the headquarters of the secret police and the government, and they stormed the buildings, and they just started tearing people apart. And when tanks came, when Soviet tanks came to go mow the people down, the tank guys couldn't do it. They ended up joining the crowd. I forget whether they were Hungarian government tanks. I think there were some Russians that turn side, and of course the Russians had to. Actually got so scared they retreated their forces, because they were afraid that this mood would be contagious to their own troops, right?
Right. Right.
And so the Khrushchev sent, guess who? Yuri Andropov was the ambassador
Hmm.
to Hungary. Yuri Andropov later became the head of the KGB and the head of the
Yeah.
Soviet Union. But he was famously the Johnny on the spot for the Soviet Union. And what he did is he basically deceived the Hungarians into thinking, okay, we'll leave. Let's just
Hmm.
talk. We'll leave. Let's negotiate, making them think that they could win their freedom, while the Russians were gathering the forces they need to crush them.
Yeah, and Andropov became Putin's master and an idol and just icon, really, right?
They call Putin the little Andropov, in fact.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just putting up a statue again and just overall following into the footsteps and worshiping this guy.
Yes, they put up a statue of Andropov, didn't they? And they put up a statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky
Yeah.
at the headquarters of Foreign Intelligence, the SVR. So this rebellion was crushed in Hungary, and of course the Eisenhower administration was faulted at the time because we didn't back our allies in Egypt, and we didn't back the Hungarian freedom fighters. We could have intervened,
Hmm.
but there was this. Eisenhower was, although he was ready to go to World War III, or so he told John Foster Dulles, and I think he meant it. He was cautious, and so nothing happened, nothing untoward happened then. But it was a sort of a watershed, and it was a disillusioning moment because many people in the Eastern Europe who thought the Americans will rescue us realized
Yeah.
no, the Americans won't risk nuclear war. We're more afraid now that Russia's getting stronger, and of course Russia didn't have ICBMs then, but they had the atomic bomb. The United States wasn't willing to risk a nuclear war over this uncertain situation in Hungary. Let's let the Iron Curtain remain. Let's not mess with this because we knew we'd been through a world war in the 1940s. We didn't want that again. That's pretty horrible, especially with nuclear weapons. So you can kind of understand it, but at the same time, it was demoralizing for
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
for the West, demoralizing at Suez, demoralizing in Hungary, for people who believed in our cause. And of course, this goes into like Wiener's book, Legacy of Ashes. We got it wrong in Indonesia. We tried to overthrow
Hmm.
another anti-communist in Indonesia based on fake, false information. Um, we made all kinds of mistakes. We did do one thing we did right. We put the Shah in power in Iran, which was a good thing. But then we didn't really stick by him.
Yeah.
We allowed him to be overthrown, and and of course the Middle East thing developed where the Russians were supporting the Egyptians and the Syrians. We were aligned with the Saudi Arabians and the Gulf states because of the oil. We developed that oil. The king of Saudi Arabia had met with FDR coming back from, I think it was coming back from Yalta in 1945, and they actually met on the cruiser where FDR was sailing back on in, I think it was in Egypt, where he was docked then. So this alliance with Saudi Arabia is going to be very important. And right now the Saudis have gone over to the Chinese and the Russians as far as we can tell. Of course, they can change sides rather quickly because that's part of their culture, but they're looking out for number one. And we're not really defending our friends the way we should. We have this history of abandoning our allies and not treating them right.
Yeah.
Right. And we just saw this with this Vietnam, and we're not even finished with the Vietnam story. So this is the environment in which the War of the Moles and Galitzin's defection happens. I should finish just briefly the Vietnam story. Vietnam is defending successfully. Nixon gets drop kicked in Watergate. He resigns in, I think it's October of 1974, if I'm remembering, because I was there. I watched it on TV happening live. I was 16 years old at the time, and it was at this moment that, of course, you had the election, the November 1974 congressional elections, and the left won all kinds of seats. Right? People were unhappy with the war because of all the protests. They were unhappy with Nixon. Nixon was evidently a bad guy, even though he won a landslide victory in 1972, and he ended the Vietnam War by the Paris Peace Accord successfully. He was suddenly, they managed, it was like you won the game, but they opened the game back up again, and you come back and you take the victory. You snatch the, snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory. Right? So we lost, and so this Congress that got elected in 1974 comes in, is sworn into office at the beginning of January 1975, and what is the first thing they do? They cut all the assistance to the Republic of Vietnam and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And so then what happens is, like we see in the Ukrainian front is destabilizing for lack of shells and supplies from America. We cut them off. Their front is starting to break right now. Maybe the new bill that they passed will send it, but in Vietnam there was no bill. Congress said, no, we're not giving anything. They ran out of shells. They ran out of fuel for their tanks and helicopters. They ran out of bullets for their troops. And the division started, the North Vietnamese started an offensive into the south again. They were pushing on Cambodia as well. And the divisions just one by one, they just collapsed.
Wasn't that in 73, the meeting? Wasn't it 73? The meeting with the American delegation visiting China, with Kissinger?
No, the Kissinger, that's whole other subject, but it was 1971 that Kissinger went to China, and that was all revolved around the conspiracy and death of Lin Biao, which is a very strange episode that we should talk about in a future episode, because it looks like it was it was definitely a fabricated series of events blamed on Lin Biao, who was the head of the People's Liberation Army. And I know some things from Colonel Stanislav Lunev, who knew somebody who was involved in some of that in the KGB or in the GRU side, Soviet military intelligence. There was a fake border war between China and Russia, which the West believed. And the conspiracy, some of the evidence in the conspiracy, there's a book called The Conspiracy and Death of Lin Biao, saying that Lin Biao was organizing fake border conflict working with the Russian general staff. So evidently Western intelligence had information about this, and they had to explain it. And how they explained it was Lin Biao was working with the Soviets to overthrow Mao. That was how they turned the story to make the evidence seem like Mao was still able to ally with the Americans, because that was the objective, getting America to accept China as its new ally against the Soviet Union. And of course, you have the curious, revelations of H.R. Haldeman and the Ends of Power. He was Nixon's chief of staff. All of that was going on, started happening in the 70s, but the beginning of the opening to China was in 71. And of course, it was believed that because we split China and Russia from each other, of course, we did nothing. Yeah. They sold us this idea we could make this peace in Vietnam, which, of course, the Chinese and Russians turned around and started feeding military supplies to the Army of North Vietnam. And it was not that there was a peasant uprising and the angered South Vietnamese peasants rose up and overthrew the Republic of Vietnam. That didn't happen at all. It was an Su-152 Soviet tank destroyer, rolling down the street in Saigon because their heavy weapons had broken through. There was no defense. Vietnam fell, and it was a colossal disaster. I remember people were afraid that President Ford, who had taken over for Nixon when Nixon resigned, was going to send the Marines, that we were going to intervene to prevent this collapse. Of course, it would have required a massive intervention. The U.S. probably, because of the build down at the end of the war, the draft was ended, I think, in 74. Nixon ended the draft. Maybe it was 73. No, I think it was 74. So there was no more draft. And so it wouldn't have been possible for us to intervene practically at that point. And of course, we just let it go. And it was a huge defeat. It was a loss not only of Vietnam, but of Cambodia. These two countries, I remember we had Cambodian refugees. Our church took in, he was a colonel, he was a Cambodian Air Force colonel, and his family, they ate at our dinner table. We helped to feed them. Our church worked to do that. there were, I mean, California especially, a lot of these people were fleeing with the shirts on their backs because they were going to be killed when the communists took over. And of course, we know in the killing fields of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge communists killed between a quarter and a third
Hmm.
of the population of Cambodia.
Yeah, and the
That's a communist massacre. That's what they do. And in Vietnam, we don't know the numbers that they murdered in Vietnam.
yeah, we also we talked about that whole Kissinger, uh, Kissinger's life. Basically, we talked about that in one of the episodes that people can find on this channel, because he died fairly recently, and
Last year,
yeah,
was it?
we talked about the bombing campaign, what's it called, Operation Menu or whatever, and this whole idea that Kissinger spread of world peace. We're going to have sort of uh, you know, a way to live with the Soviet Union and the Chinese, and everybody's going to be separate, and it's all going to work out fine. But
Yeah, Kissinger was going to be the Metternich of the Cold
he
War
studied
peace.
Metternich.
Yes, he
He
did.
worked on that at Harvard. He worked on Metternich and Castlereagh from Britain, and
Castlereagh. Yeah,
that was his education, really. But I mean, he was a local. Kissinger is from around here where I am. You know, his family was, I think, a bit more affluent, and so they were allowed to leave when many other Jewish families and even relatives of him, they couldn't leave, and so then he studied at Harvard, and he had some sort of a working relationship with the FBI, and he just became this big shot, all of a sudden. Of course, until he was named as a Soviet agent by a Polish defector who saw
Michael
his name on a list.
Galanowski.
Yeah,
Yeah,
who saw his name on a list in a safe, and that was at a time when Kissinger, I think, was still at Harvard, or he was not yet a famous man. So this was
he
not.
was though. He was no, actually, he was. Well, the defection of Galanowski. Galanowski worked as a British agent and an American agent. He was codenamed Sniper. And he was in Polish military intelligence. He was a colonel general, very high ranked, right? And so he was the most important, one of the most important spies that we ever had, that the West ever had in the communist bloc. And of course, he provided lots of it. You could read about him. He broke spy rings. When he defected, he really helped us enormously. It was a very damaging breach of the communist intelligence. But of course, they were onto him pretty fast, so he had to get out
Yeah,
of there before they killed him. So he got out. But after he got out, they had this thing. He had this thing about Kissinger. He'd seen a list of Rote Kapelle agents recruited in 1945 in Germany. And general he shared an office space with had this safe with this list in it. He had a heart attack. This other general had a heart attack. Golanowski got the keys to the safe and the combination, and so he memorized the list. And on the list was Sergeant Henry A. Kissinger, U.S. Army, recruited by the GRU in 1945, according to Golanowski. Now, there was a discrediting of Golanowski because he later claimed to be the son of the Tsar, the heir to the Romanovs, um, that had somehow survived, which was completely crazy. And the question is that was he given a self-destruct drug? Was he poisoned with one of these mind control drugs to have this break with reality, or was he pretending? I think Peter Wright in Spycatcher speculated that maybe Golanowski was faking insanity to keep from being assassinated, because Sir Roger Hollis, because part of his security detail was not was pulled off of him. And of course, he was living in New York at the time. I think he had gone to the United States, so that Golanowski was living here. But very strange case, because he had had such good information.
yeah,
And of course, this taints everything. But what's really interesting is Kissinger's reaction. and of course there's been a couple of books. Gary Allen wrote a book on Kissinger, and of course Frank Capel wrote Henry Kissinger's Soviet Agent. What they pointed out was maybe more interesting, that Kissinger had appointed people in the State Department who had communist connections, who actually got kicked back out for being security risks. And there's more than one. There's quite a few of them that Kissinger brought in. And then there's General Palmer's book about the Vietnam War and Kissinger's role in demoralizing um, the Material Assistance Command Vietnam and threatening them and bullying people. And then there's H.R. Haldeman's testimony that Kissinger acted like a spy. He would try to read things on his desk. He was always engaged in snooping all the time, which was and H.R. Haldeman thought it was funny, right? He didn't realize the implications of it, the potential implications when you put everything together. And then you have the CIA counterintelligence guy, Leonard McCoy, who at the very end of Kissinger's tenure as Secretary of State basically accused Kissinger of being a Soviet agent. And this is in the book Widows, where McCoy wanted to brief Kissinger about the agents we had in Moscow, this agent we had in Moscow that information was coming from, and you can't mention this and you can't mention that. You can't even drop a hint because this will get this guy killed. Yeah. And Kissinger was going to go in with Anatoly Dobrinin, the Soviet ambassador. Kissinger was going to go into the Russian embassy with him. Ugh. And they really would have preferred he not, and that he needed to be very, and so what does Kissinger do? Kissinger just arrogantly is Kissinger. He goes in there and he goes out, and then it was within hours our agents disappeared. Wow. Our agent in Moscow is, basically gone. And this made, and of course later in Widows, I think it was James Angleton made the statement, well, in terms of Kissinger, we made a mistake not investigating him. There was probably something there, Yeah,
I mean, he reminds us. I mean, he reminds us of these atomic spies, because the famous, quite a few of these famous atomic spies, they were foreigners. They were not. Sometimes they were not born in America. They were born in Germany. Had a Jewish background, which was, of course, used by Soviet intelligence for a certain pitch, a recruitment pitch. Telling these people that the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had played a major role in defeating the Nazis and all that narrative. This was a way to approach people that had a German background or a German Jewish background, right? And this is something, because when we speculate about Kissinger's motivation, he came from here. I mean, this is the Nuremberg area, southern Germany. Fürth, I think the city of Fürth. He played soccer there, if I remember correctly, and so he felt alienated here because of that crazy climate. And then he came to the United States, and this was, of course, a whole different world. So he felt,
and he always spoke with a very thick German accent, by the way, Kissinger did, and so he wasn't really an American in the sense that he didn't even sound like an American. But what's really interesting is that in the two books on Kissinger that most fascinated me by people who worked with him and saw him in action, General Palmer, who was the deputy head of Material Assistance Command Vietnam under Generals Westmoreland and his successor, whose name is escaping me. But General Palmer described Kissinger as someone who postured as a hawk, but who did all kinds of things that actually helped the communists, that demoralized our side and helped them. And General Palmer does not accuse Kissinger of being a Soviet agent, but he has this very disturbing picture of Kissinger. And the same thing for H.R. Haldeman. There's no accusation of Kissinger being a communist agent. It's that Kissinger presents himself as the hawk of hawks, I think was Haldeman's term. But in reality, he was going along with the liberal media. He was snitching on Nixon behind his back, saying bad things about Nixon, saying bad things about the right. So that Kissinger was like two-faced. right?
Mm.
Very much two-faced. And this goes with the Pentagon Papers. People don't realize this, and it was I think it was Haldeman that pointed this out. Yeah, it was Haldeman that Daniel Ellsberg, who was behind the Pentagon Papers, was the guy that released it. Um, these papers were done under the Johnson administration,
The Rand
and
Corporation, right?
yeah, I think so. Daniel Ellsberg, they were like academic who he was a protege of Kissinger. Ellsberg
Hmm.
was a protege of Kissinger, right? And so they're like
The
the
Hawk
Defense
of
Department
Hawks.
hires these intellectuals and says, well, write a fancy paper about why we should be in Vietnam. So this is a liberal intellectual saying, oh, yeah, we're there for the tungsten, for imperialism, for the stuff, right?
Ugh.
And so that all of a sudden becomes true somehow, even though this leftist intellectual is right. And of course, Kissinger was very upset by the Pentagon Papers because it actually exposed him because of his
Hmm.
connection to Ellsberg. He didn't want people to know about this, and so Kissinger actually goes to Nixon and says, "You have to do something about this, Mr. President." And Nixon saying, "Oh, it's the Johnson administration. I didn't do anything. I don't care if it gets out. It's the mud is all on Johnson." That's the way Kissinger looked at it. You look weak, Mr. President. So Haldeman said that Kissinger knew how to get at Nixon,
Hmm.
because Nixon didn't saw himself as a tough guy, didn't want to seem weak. So next thing you know, the White House plumbers are going and burglarizing Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, right?
Yeah.
Nick, and it was Kissinger who basically provoked Nixon to do this, which ultimately these plumbers end up doing the Watergate thing, which ends up, Nixon ends up getting fried for that, even though all the previous presidents had done these dirty trick type things.
Hmm. I remember this
Going back to
episode.
FDR.
I remember this episode about Kissinger. This was when some people in the U.S. government they were hesitant to put people into positions regarding American support for Israel. They didn't want too many people involved who had a Jewish background because of optics and other factors. And so Kissinger, he tried to play the super hawk, and he gave that statement of something along the lines of, even if something terrible happens to the Jews because of the Soviets, it's just a political problem. It was some weird statement that sounded incredibly detached and incredibly cold. Now, this may not have been the actual opinion of Kissinger himself, but this is what Kissinger may have believed was the opinion of powerful Americans. So maybe this was maybe sort of almost a Freudian slip or something, where you could maybe tell what Kissinger was really thinking, and maybe how he was approached by the GRU, telling him that the Soviets are maybe more the friends of the Jews than the Anglos, and we fought the Nazis, and the Anglos, they did all this appeasement, especially the British, and the Americans were only getting involved at a later stage. So this may have been one of the approaches of the Soviets when they apparently recruited Kissinger.
Well, the thing is, some people collaborate as I think Heinz Felfus may be an example of this. They get recruited because they're ambitious.
Oh yeah.
And they realize that if they can get some kind of collaboration with the other side, they can look like heroes to their own side, because the other side can feed them things that will make them look better.
Successful.
So there's somebody who can play both sides against the middle has an advantage if he can get cooperation, he can get information from both sides. So I think there are these people that do this. And Falfa, there's evidence, isn't there, that Falfa was this kind of character who was as much manipulating his handlers as they were manipulating him. And I think Kissinger might be in that category. If indeed he was a spy. Look, we don't know, if Walt Rostow, also who played the hawk who's got these left-wing views, the anti-communist leftist or liberal, maybe he was sincere and just made all these mistakes.
And I think it's also,
but with Kissinger, it's a little harder to, we know much more about Kissinger because his deceptiveness, his way of negotiating
Mm.
with Lee Duc-Tho, the North Vietnamese foreign minister at Paris peace talks, that Kissinger had to have known how the communists behaved at the earlier peace talks. He had to have
Mm.
known that the communists, and of course, he was the architect of the ABM Treaty, which the Soviets cheated on, and SALT I, which the Soviets cheated at. Of course, the cheats were built into the language of the treaty, and Kissinger allowed it. Now, for such a smart guy, he should have realized that these weasel
Yeah.
words, that the communists would say, "Oh no, we're not violating it. See, it says right here," and just go, "You interpret it like that? That
Yeah.
you
So,
know?" And this is what they did. They created the whole Soviet ABM system, massive ABM system. They said, "Oh no, those are just surface to air missiles for shooting down bombers."
mhm.
They were really dual purpose,
Yeah, and it's like
right? SAM's ABMs.
it does feed into the grandiosity of some of these people recruited if the Soviets tell them your actions will help a balance of power and this will
Yes,
prevent a
that's
world
true.
war. Because if you are in that position as a recruited agent and you deliver secrets and you feed bad stuff into let's say the American government, it's sort of this grandiosity ploy. I'm here, I'm playing the American government, and this will create world peace, or this will create a common system one day. This will prevent a world war. I mean, it's not so. It's not just a line that an agent will present when he's caught and when he's on trial, because that happened. You know, it was a German agent. I think his code name was Topaz. It was a German and worked in NATO, in I think the headquarters, and he delivered the German defense plans in the Cold War to the Soviets. And when he was caught, he gave that traditional line: "I just wanted to prevent World War III. I wanted to create a balance of power because if there's a balance, they don't annihilate each other." And so, I mean, to a degree, this was just a trained statement they were supposed to give when they're totally caught, to make themselves look better and make the cause look better. Because if they just
Yeah.
said we
I'm not a
want
traitor.
Soviet
I'm trying to
dominance,
save civilization, right?
yeah, it's not like I'm a traitor who wanted total Soviet dominance over the planet. I wanted the balance. That was part of it, but I think that some of these assets that were recruited, they may not have been fully convinced of Soviet communism, but they wanted the Korea, they wanted to proceed, and they believe this grandiosity, or they like this idea of grandiosity, of shaking up
Right.
world
Well,
power and dominance.
grandiosity is the mark of a narcissist and a traitor. Often have that. They find that in Benedict Arnold, the famous American traitor of the American Revolution. You find grandiosity in Benedict Arnold, and it's a red flag. All right. Well, maybe we should stop here because I think we're close to 3 hours, and we have covered a lot of very controversial, difficult material. And next week we can maybe talk about the Galitzin defection and the Kennedy assassination, maybe all in one bundle, because there's an awful lot there. Because an awful lot is determined later on about the way people think about America in this, and it's very topical right now. It doesn't end; it's become a kind of mythology. And so I want to thank our listeners for joining us on this part 2 on the Cold War, and I hope you'll join us next week. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the U.S., and my co-host has been Alex Benesch in Germany. Hope to see you next time.